This episode of the Forge podcast is brought to you by the generous donations of Theo Fattel and Brady Turner, along with all of our other amazing Patreon supporters. If you would like to become part of the Forge community, you can learn more at patreon.com/Forge Genesys. Thank you.
Correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to the Forge.
Hello, Gamer Nation, and welcome to the Forge, a Genesys RPG podcast covering everything that you need to know about the latest and greatest from Fantasy Flight Games, Genesys Foundry, and the Genesys Role Playing Game. I'm your host, GM Hurley, and we have a heaping helping of shifty, mutation, magic-y goodness for your episode tonight. In diecasting, we'll be tackling a listener request to dive into the Shapeshifter talents from the Realms of Terranoth setting. In the Furnace, we'll come to our penultimate episode in our De-mystifying the Mystical series on magic in Genesys and reskinning it for other purposes. In Breaking the Mould, we'll be talking to Seth Rattan about his exciting product, the Gamemaster's Eclectic Toolkit. And of course, we'll be answering your games and rules questions in Under the Hammer. For now, however, let me introduce you to the Hyde to my Jekyll, the Grievous to my Obi-Wan, and the Plankton to my SpongeBob. It's GM Chris. Chris, how you doing?
General Kenobi. No, it's General Kenobi. Yeah, that's still not. I'll get it eventually.
No, eventually, that's okay.
Yeah. Maybe I can get that good cough going. That I can find someone who's got the coronavirus.
Right.
Swap spit for a little while. That's in really bad taste. That's in terrible. That's people are dying. That's in terrible taste. I'm so sorry.
People are dying. Jesus.
People are dying. Yes, it's awful. And I'm quarantined in my home and getting a little not because I have COVID. Just what do they call it? Managing your personal space. What do they call it? Self-imposed quarantine, whatever they're calling it.
Yeah, I think they call that social distancing, Chris.
Stay inside. I'm staying inside. That's what I'm doing. I'm going a little batty, and that's fine. That's fine.
Fine.
It's all good. It's all good. At least I still get to podcast.
Yeah,
which is really all that matters, Hooli, in my little world right now is the podcasting of the things and the stuff.
You know what, Chris? We should really get on to talking about the Foundry.
Yeah, gosh, you're beyond right.
All right, so we've got a few things to discuss and some great new stuff available on the Foundry. So let's get into it in Stoking the Fire.
Stoking the Fire.
And welcome to Stoking the Fire, a segment dedicated to letting you know all there is to know about the releases from the Genesys Foundry and the Genesys Role Playing Game. But first, Chris, would you like to tell us about the D20 Radio podcast of the week?
You know I would. So if you guys listening are a fan of RPGs of all stripes, like me, and you're intrigued by not only discussion on disparate systems that you may have only heard of, as well as actual play of those systems, like me, then you should really be listening to the Story Told podcast. Amazing show. Chaz and the crew, they put on an incredible production that is dedicated to exposing RPG fans to all the amazing systems and stories, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that can be told. Their most recent episode 48 was a brilliant overview of something I've been dying to get on the table, the City of Mist RPG by Son of Oak Game Studio. It is I don't know if you've heard of this, Hooli. It is a wicked mashup of like urban noir and myth. It's almost like a spiritual successor to Urban Arcana. Okay. But you can replace like the Dungeons and Dragons monstery goodness with like mythological history, magic and monstery and goodness. Right.
Wow.
It's incredible. It looks like an absolute blast. And I love this episode because I learned a lot more about it in this really comprehensive overview. So you guys should give it a listen to find out more. And you guys can find The Story Told and many more amazing podcasts of gaming and geekery goodness over at d20radio.com.
Indeed. No, I haven't had a chance to listen to it, and I'm unfamiliar with City of Mist. I think I've saw an advertisement about it sometime or whatever, so I will go and check that out. Thanks, Chris. I love new podcasts, so that's great. Now, before we get on to the new items in the Foundry, we have a great deal of new news and updates on the state and future of Genesys and the other role-playing games that are produced by Fantasy Flight Games.
That do.
What's been out there?
Well, the wait is over. We all kind of have finally been let in on the end result to the rumor and the speculation and the notification and everything else.
Yep.
As we reported on this very podcast and also on D20 Radio, and as kind of the rest of the internet became aware, obviously, Huli, back in early January, the RPG department at Fantasy Flight Games was let go. And, very sad. Obviously, our friends and designers, good people, talented people, who've poured their heart and soul into these games. We're very sad for that. And this led to a lot of speculation about, that possibly, Asmodee was going to be selling FFG, that they were going to be offloading the RPG products entirely to another company. And that this may very well be the end of the RPGs that we know and love, like Genesys and Star Wars and L5R. And we got a report from a solid source from within FFG that the long-term plan at FFG was to discontinue RPG development. This meant a lot of very crazy things to us. Shortly after that report broke, there were a couple of contradictory reports that came out online. FFG themselves had a live stream where they were demoing something, and in the live stream comments, somebody asked about this very question. And, one of the admins said, no, we're not discontinuing the RPGs. Stay tuned. We have announcements coming.
Yep.
Okay? Then, just a few days ago, at least at the time of this recording, at GAMA, the Game Manufacturers Association trade show, GAMA 2020, there was the Asmodee panel, and onto Reddit leaked an image and a quick report from somebody attending who basically said that Asmodee was not losing these RPGs, but basically FFG was. That these RPGs were being transitioned away from FFG and to Edge Entertainment, which is a French-Spanish publication house that is also owned by Asmodee and has been since, I think, 2017.
Yep.
And basically, they would be taking over the RPG lines. And this was a little confusing to some of us because, Edge Entertainment was basically a publishing distribution studio. They had handled the European language translations for these various RPGs. And so, a lot of us were a little mystified by that. But then one day after that, and then the day after that, in short order, we finally saw an official announcement, then followed by a lengthy interview, actually, with Steve Horvath, who Huli, you may know. I mean, used to be with FFG and then moved into actually as head of publishing at Asmodee North America specifically.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty lengthy interview that he did with Zach Bunn from Team Covenant, where they went into all kinds of stuff. But the bottom line is that we were all right and we were all wrong. We were all right in the fact that, yes, Fantasy Flight Games, unfortunately, is flat out getting rid of any type of RPG development. They are discontinuing it.
Yep.
However, Asmodee is not. Obviously, Asmodee, the owner of Fantasy Flight, still owns these RPG properties, and they have decided, based on the trends in the industry right now, to, at a conglomerate-wide level, not just at Fantasy Flight, but everywhere, really tighten up the way that games are produced and manufactured and created. And to that end, Asmodee, as a parent company, has said, we want all RPG production that we do as a company handled by one of our companies. We want one studio in-house to handle everything. And to that end, Edge Entertainment spun off a brand new studio called Edge Studio.
Yep.
You can go to edgestudio.net, and actually they have a temporary website up that looks pretty cool. And that was kind of the first official announcement. I mean, and ultimately they announced on their website that they will be taking over Genesys, Star Wars, L5R, The End of the World, and Zombicide. They announced actually 5 RPGs and basically said, we're going to do reprints.
Yep.
of old material, and we're going to be publishing new material. So it's a very interesting time. And Huli, did you watch the interview with Horvath?
I did, and it is lengthy, but it's really, really interesting. There is a lot of stuff that Steve couldn't say because, there are plans in motion, and they've already said that it's going to be probably 12 months before we hear anything from Edge Studios. Because obviously there's going to be a transition period, there's going to be setups and whatever else. And, as a freelancer for FFG, I know that from, concept to publishing, it's normally about 12 months. So it's possible that they have one, maybe two projects that they have working. But my understanding is previous licenses, they had to produce one book per year to keep the rights for that. So obviously this year we're going to be getting the final book that was coming from FFG Studios, which is the vehicles book for Star Wars. We're also getting the Keyforge book from for Genesys. And that seems to be what FFG was sort of, I don't know whether they had plans in the long term for winding down. These sort of things don't happen just in a bubble and perhaps overnight. We know that obviously the layoffs have happened overnight, but as far as the, what products are getting produced, that they've done Keyforge this year, and who knows what they're going to do for next year. I know that there's a lot of pressure from just the community generally for something like Tannhauser. Which, would be, I think, quite interesting. I'd like to see something a little bit different. I'd like to see Twilight Imperium, for example, but, who knows what they will do. We may also see, perhaps a second edition of Star Wars, that moves more towards the Genesys rules. Who knows? It's all going to be complete speculation at this point.
It is. What intrigued me most about Steve's interview was, because I tend to geek out about like state of the industry style stuff, was talking about kind of the industry trends and market level changes that are happening in the industry right now.
Yeah.
And it's he's not wrong. It's plain as the nose in your face for anyone who's paying attention. I mean, what's happened in the past several years with new technologies, Kickstarter, the fact that anyone under the sun can basically be a publisher, it's caused sort of and then ultimately there's things he didn't talk about but inferred. So RPGs are more popular now than they've ever been.
Yep.
Okay. Ever. And this is in no small part due to the Diana Jones winner in 2019, which, as you recall, was actual play.
Yeah.
Okay. RPGs are cool now. Everyone's playing them. And as a result, they're hot. And we've almost got this like RPG bubble happening in the industry where there's thousands of products being produced. And they've reached a point where there's just not enough store shelf space to really make it work the way it used to. So Asmodee felt that things needed to change. And that's not just in the RPG space, but in the overall space, board games as well.
Yeah, because they moved into, like Steve basically went through that they'd sliced FFG, not physically, like company-wise, but they've put it in two. So we've got board games and card games, and then we've got miniatures games on the other half. So, they can develop things and really focus their attention rather than, as he said in the interview, have people that are dragged across into to another project for a short period of time. And so as a result, the focus is lost a little bit. So now by moving things the way that they are, including with the RPGs, they can really focus and try to be industry leaders. And I mean, I think that what FFG did is leading the industry anyway. But with the popularity of D&D, I would like to see the same sort of uptake of Genesys and Star Wars that we see from things like D&D. I mean, D&D is always going to be a product where it's an entry level drug, for want of a better term. But there are plenty of other RPGs which are out there. Literally thousands of different settings and systems that places like Drive-Thru RPG really, really helps. But it does mean that some of the bigger companies have to super focus so that they can keep things, that they can keep things fresh and ahead of the curve, so to speak.
Basically, yeah. And, guys, I encourage you all to watch the interview with Steve Horvath.
Yeah.
That you can find it on YouTube, Team Covenant. And he spent the most of the time talking about kind of what's happening with Asmodee and FFG from a board game standpoint. Dude, Imperial Assault.
Yes.
Clone Wars Armada, X-Wing, Legion, I don't want to get into that here because this is not the show for that. but to kind of sum up what he said about the RPGs specifically, in regards to this new studio of Edge Studio, clearly spun off of Edge Entertainment, that is as he said, in Europe. We are not yet familiar with who the names and writers are behind it, but Steve did say that these were the direct people who were the minds behind the End of the World RPG, which I've played, and it was fantastic. But basically saying, all RPGs will continue to go on as they are, but as you mentioned earlier, Huli would be transitioned to Edge Studio by the end of the year. Yeah. It's not the worst news. I wish it was different. I wish our good friends at FFG were still making these RPGs. But I am very excited and pleased, and no small amount of me is relieved that these RPGs are going to continue. Yeah, absolutely. In a managed production way.
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions that did get asked recently was, and I can sort of speak about this just from my experience, is that they're sort of saying, well, look, maybe the previous developers as well as other freelancers are going to come back on board with Edge Studios to do products. The only thing that I can say to that, even if they were, they would not be able to say a thing about it because of NDAs. And so you can ask the question as much as you want until you go blue in the face. It's not going to get answered until until Edge Studios starts to advertise what they've got coming. So yeah, that's as simple as that. As much as we'd like to report on that, that sort of information is just not going to be available to the general public until the studio itself decides what they want to do.
Yeah. And it's going to be a while. We've got at least till the end of the year till we're probably going to hear anything else. Yep. But what that means, Uli, is it is going to be an interesting future for sure. And it means that the year of 2020, when it comes to Genesys, is going to revolve around what we now have confirmed will still be in place, the Foundry. Indeed.
And what does that mean? That means new Foundry content. Because we've got a couple of new items that are all about the Terranoth love. So we should really get into that. So first up is a new offering from first-timer Matthias Alfonso, who did an incredible job with the Tome of Fantastic Items. Now, this magic item compendium details over 100 different magic items to be used in the Terranoth setting, as well as special rule options for buying and selling magic items, handling magic items and avoiding hoarding them, creating cursed items, enhancing heroic abilities with characteristic items, identifying magic items, and handing out treasure in a quick and easy manner. Something that I absolutely hate about games is shopping sessions. I think everybody can relate to me with that. But this 40-page tome is a boon to any GM running a Terranoth game, though frankly it is really compatible with any fantasy setting using the Genesys rules, and it's a great buy at only $5.99.
Yeah, it's a very, very cool product. There's so much in it. He did a great job. Wonderful resource. Matthias, good on you for your first time outing, man. But continuing the Terranoth goodness is a return from the man and the machine that is the Terranoth Tinkerer himself. I'm going to start calling him the Terranoth Tinkerer of Terror. Chris Markham with Terranoth Treasures Volume 2. This was a follow-up to his Terranoth Treasures Volume 1. This new volume brings us another 15 additional Terranoth magic items, each one derived from previous lore in the Terranoth setting world, from games like Runebound and Descent. But now, again, 15 new items with new art and rules adapted for Genesys. And just like Volume 1, each item is fully illustrated and given specific components for GMs to use as adventure seeds and additional rewards for players who want to create their own items. And yes, you can use Volume 2 without Volume 1, but it is worth noting that Volume 1 does provide the additional crafting rules that Volume 2 does not have. New great entry from Chris coming in, $2.95.
Yep. Now, Chris is also offering in his March Madness sale his entire catalogue, which is absolutely amazing. It includes Ministries of Manara, Terranoth Taverns, Terranoth Treasures 1 and 2, and Xanagan Zoology Part 1. And it's only $5, which is fantastic, so go and check that out. And just while we're here, I just want to throw a big shout out to many of the Genesys Foundry authors who've dropped their prices during the COVID-19 pandemic. Since, most people are going to be stuck at home or should be stuck at home as part of the, the social isolation thing that they've got happening. So well done to all of the authors. Keep up the great work. And to our listeners, please support them by purchasing any material that you can. If you haven't got it already, go and support the authors as well. A lot of people are struggling out there or will be in the not too distant future. So please go and check those out. And if you can purchase it, great. Go ahead and do that. Now, you can also find these and many more great Genesys Foundry content over at drivethrurpg.com by simply performing a search using the words Genesys Foundry.
And while you're surfing the web, why not jump over and become a supporter of The Forge by joining our Patreon? $2 a month, that's all we ask. You can access our dedicated Discord server where you can interact with fellow forgers. No. Oh, that's okay. That's not good.
Yeah. Look, the latest one is Smiths, which I thought was interesting. But then somebody else suggested that you and I should be the blacksmiths, and hopefully I'm getting forgings moving forward. I'm pushing for that. Forgings, love it.
Right now. Anyway, higher tiers provide priority for your game and rules questions for the Patreon, with our largest tier not only giving you a special thank you at the top of the show, but also a special monthly get-together with either Huli or myself to discuss your Foundry product or your campaign. But no matter what, anything you can spare to show your support to us is really appreciated. And please know that all of your donations do help the podcast directly so that we can continue to provide you with excellent regular Genesys content.
And don't forget that coming up in the not-too-distant future, we'll be talking about the Forge Awards. And the only way that you can vote in the Forge Awards is to become a Patreon. And that's at any level. So, as Chris said, for only $2 a month, you can have the rights to vote in the Forge Awards. But we'll talk about that closer to the event. But join the Forge community by becoming a supporter at patreon.com/ForgeGenesys.
Okay, Huli. Are you ready to cast a magic spell and get to rocking and a-rolling?
Indeed I am, Chris. Time to get into some die casting.
Die casting.
So the Forge podcast is nothing if not all about bringing new creations to the table. And the Genesys RPG provides us all with a powerful set of tools to do so, specifically skills and talents. Our die casting segment is about closely examining individual skills and individual talents and how they relate to the creations you craft. Last episode, we took a look at the vehicle handling skills in Genesys, driving, piloting, operating, and we explored varied ways to use those skills in your creations for the Foundry and in your own campaigns, including some brand new gear and equipment to boost those skills for days. But tonight, by listener request, we are returning the discussion to talents with a transformative peek at the Shapeshifter talents from Realms of Terra.
Oh dear, you're a goose. That's right, Chris. Tonight we'll be going to dig into a pair of unusual talents with strong, some might say overpowered, but as Chris says, we'll come to that, mechanical benefits that represent some of the more classic tropes in fantasy, horror, and weird fiction, and, of course, role-playing. The ability to shapeshift into another creature. How do these talents work? How can you and should you properly represent them in your games? Not only is there a right and a wrong way to utilize these talents in a balanced way, but a clever GM can also make them an exciting focal point into their campaign.
All right, Huli. So let's talk about the basics. What are these talents? How do they work?
All right, so first of all, both of these talents are located in Realms of Terranos. It's on page 84 and 89, respectively. This means they were designed for a fantasy setting and can consequently be used in any fantasy game that you're running. But as we'll see, they can easily be pulled into just about any setting of any kind. So the first one that we have is the Shapeshifter talent. So it's a tier 1. Its activation is passive, and it's non-ranked. And it says, when your character is incapacitated due to having exceeded their strain threshold, while in their normal form, they undergo the following change as an out-of-turn incidental. They heal all strain, increase their brawn and agility by 1 to a maximum of 5, and reduce their intellect and willpower by 1 to a minimum of 1. They deal +1 damage when making unarmed attacks, and their unarmed attacks have a critical rating of 3, but they cannot use magic skills or make ranged attacks. Your GM should ensure that NPCs react appropriately to this, at the very least, upgrading the difficulty of social skill checks twice. Your character reverts to their normal form after 8 hours, or if they become incapacitated, for instance, by exceeding their wound or strain threshold. So let's talk about this talent. It's obviously designed to represent characters who have, a wear disease. Classically speaking, it's lycanthropy. So let's talk about that first.
Well, yeah, because the thing is, this talent is, it doesn't mention lycanthropy. It doesn't even talk about any narrative implications of the transformation. Much is left to the mind of the reader. Okay, and that's quite intentional. This talent is quite generic. Intentionally so, in true Genesys fashion. Is the character a werewolf? Are they a werebear? Are they a were-rat, a were-toad, a were-turtle? Why
not?
Why not? The point is, anything the narrative and the setting allows for, this talent is designed to accommodate. Now, what's interesting to me, Huli, is when you compare this, because we kind of have to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yep.
Because D&D classically had, radically different templates and abilities for every creature under the sun. What were all the were-creatures in D&D over there? There was, the werewolf, werebear, wereboar, were-lion, were-tiger, were-rat, were-toad, were-falcon. I've seen that one. Just on and on and on.
Yeah. You could always go to the X-Files where they did a were-human, which was a bear who got lycanthropy and transformed into I think it was, or it might have been a wolf. I can't remember what the episode was, but it was when X-Files got rebooted. It was the guy from Flight of the Conchords, and and he was playing a were-human. But anyway, it was hilarious.
It's absolutely fantastic. But when you look at how D&D did that, and they had these different templates and rules for every single different type of were-creature, you see this. Compare that to this. This is this upscale simplification that Genesys is quite frankly known for. It keeps things simple by having the thing that you shapeshift into be whatever that thing is, wolf, bear, tiger, whatever, narratively. But mechanically, there is a simple, uniform benefit.
Yep, absolutely. But, we need to talk about how this talent is used and the benefits of it, and of course its drawbacks that it provides, because this is something that a lot of players, for whatever reason, want to play some sort of a were creature, and this is a great thing for that. It also can represent, to an extent, shape-shifting abilities similar to polymorph, I guess, that aren't necessarily, or even if we talk about Harry Potter, it's that non-spell sort of way that Professor McGonagall turns into a cat, that sort of thing as well. So there's a few ways to look at that, but so let's look at that.
So first of all, when you talk about the benefits, can we talk about the fact that this is a 5 XP talent, tier 1 talent?
Yep.
That its mechanical benefit for 5 XP allows you to recover all your spent strain, all of it, when you exceed your threshold, and then you come back fresh as a daisy, tougher, faster, and with deadly natural attacks.
Is this overpowered though? That's the question, and I don't think it is. Assuming the GM considers and upholds the second part of the talent, because this is one of the few times that we see a narrative drawback to what is really a mechanical boon. Being a shapeshifter is supposed to be scary. It's supposed to be frightening, and it's looked down upon socially. So to have that last segment there, which talks about upgrading the difficulty of any social skills twice, it totally makes sense. If you've got someone who is fighting in a throne room and suddenly goes down, and all of a sudden just turns into a werebear, it's not as though they're going, "Oh, welcome, Mr. Werebear. Please carry on fighting." People will be freaking out.
And let's be clear when we look at the talent description here. It doesn't say, "Hey, also upgrade the difficulty for social skills checks twice." It says, "At the very least." It says specifically, it's in the book, "At the very least, upgrading the difficulty of social skill checks twice." That's at the very least, because if it becomes known what you are, a shapeshifter, okay, it's torch wielding mob time, man.
Yep, and you'll find yourself living in a swamp.
Yeah, I mean that's what happens. So is this talent overpowered? No, because it has that narrative consequence.
Yeah.
God, I also think, Hooli, this is exacerbated by the fact that many times this shapeshift transformation is involuntary.
Yep.
You can make yourself spend all your strain, I guess. But if it just happens naturally and you don't want it to, you're hosed. And once it happens, you can't physically end it until 8 hours have passed or you pass out, whichever comes.
That's right. And there's a lot of people, a lot of players that I think use it as a bit of I guess they use it as a way to get your character back up again. Virtually, I guess when it comes to it, they're doubling their strain threshold. But, smart, clever GMs, as you've said in the past, good GMs doing good GM things, that you're not going to allow that to sort of happen in a bubble. You're going to be really focusing in on that in the storyline to make things very, very difficult. And that may be a case that at some point you need to find a cure or something like that, especially if the player really sort of says, yeah, I thought this talent did something that it doesn't obviously do. Well, it does, but it's making things very, very difficult in the campaign. Maybe I want to try to find a cure. And that can obviously create an entire adventure behind that. And it may be a case that you swap out that 5 XP talent and things like that. So there's quite a number of options there.
Yes.
Now, one quick point that I really want to make, and this is something for GMs to consider, especially if you want to force a PC to, change involuntarily, and you want a really good way of doing that. You want them to, reveal their hand, so to speak. Like this is a tactic that would be something that perhaps a sinister nemesis would do to reveal the truth of a character's origins to a crowd of people or to jurors in some sort of trial, like in a Salem witch trial-esque sort of story that you're telling, where this particular NPC might be attempting to, gain some sort of support for running the PCs out of town so that they're no longer in the way of his, dastardly plan. And the way to do that is through social encounters, mainly because social encounters don't target wounds. They target strain. So to get that NPC to learn the shapeshifting PC's flaws and fears with their advantages and triumphs during socials checks, that's something that, that they start pushing that PC's buttons. so that their strain drops, and they're targeting all the time because they know perhaps that the PC does transform because they may have seen them sort of hiding away in the villages or in the forests or whatever else while they're doing this transformation. And they really want to get into that stage where they can get rid of the PCs effectively. So suddenly your social encounter has the potential to go horribly wrong when it's in the middle of, whether it be a court trial or whatever else. And then suddenly, because their strain drops below zero because they've been targeted with, some sort of social talent or some sort of social attack, that suddenly they transform into this abomination. That's the sort of story that keeps players on edge and makes for truly epic adventures that they will remember for a long time to come, and they'll talk about that endlessly. So that's something else to consider. But anyway, I digress.
Now, for those shifters out there, those shapeshifters, who maybe get a bit of a better handle on their condition, we have the next published talent, which is improved shapeshifter, no?
That is correct. Now, it's a tier 2 talent. Its activation is active, incidental. So it's non-ranked, and it says once per session, your character may make a hard, that's 3 purple dice, a hard discipline check as an out-of-turn incidental, either to trigger shapeshifter or to avoid triggering it when they exceed their strain threshold. So this talent represents the shapeshifter having some level of control over their transformation. You can will it to happen, or you can will it not to happen, and that can be really, really important.
Yes.
The interesting thing, though, which is a question that we've sort of had before, is, when it comes to this side of things, it's an incidental. So if your strain threshold drops, or it goes over your strain threshold, how do you actually activate an incidental? I'm sure we'll get onto that question shortly.
No, we can talk about that now. I mean, listen, the talent, the only way it specifically says that you can make this check in order to avoid triggering it. The only way to trigger it is to exceed your strain threshold. Yep. I don't think the designers intended to set up a trigger condition that couldn't be fulfilled. Yep. Okay. Yeah. So as a GM, I mean, don't nitpick over the minutia too much. Well, he can't take an incidental. He's unconscious. No, before he drops, he can will it not to happen. That's exactly the intent of the talent.
Yeah. And the other thing as well that you have to take into consideration is that, exceeding your strain threshold doesn't necessarily mean that you've fallen unconscious. It can be that you're in a comatose state. So you're still awake, but you're just exhausted or, comatose or whatever. It doesn't mean that you just fall unconscious.
Exceeding your strain threshold means only one thing. You are incapacitated.
Yep.
Then, okay, that's it. That could be unconscious. That could be I'm so exhausted I can't move, but I'm still awake.
Yep.
Okay. And that's, it could mean all those things.
So now we know what these two talents are and, the wording and how they operate. But how do they actually work in the games that you're playing?
So I think it goes without saying that any fantasy game, or even, quite frankly, even a modern or a future game with horror elements, and of course, weird war. This is a weird war. I mean, any of those settings can shoehorn the shapeshifter condition and its corresponding talents quite nicely, don't you think?
Absolutely. If you look at Dog Soldiers, for example, I can very great film. I can very much see a Weird War story revolving around werewolves that are soldiers.
Did you see on Netflix? Did you ever watch Love, Death, and Robots?
I did. Yes.
And they had that short. It was kind of like Dog Soldiers. The idea that werewolves are real, man.
Yep.
And oh, by the way, they were and they're prejudiced against just as they should be. And I mean, like not as they should be, but you know what I mean, as it's fitting for the story and the reality of the world, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But of course, it's, if these things really existed, you better believe the military would draft them.
Oh, hell yes.
There was this awesome short where basically they're in like Afghanistan.
Yep.
And it becomes this awesome werewolf fight, and it was wicked.
that whole series is just amazing. It's very R-rated, but the stories that they tell are amazing.
It was episode 10, and it was actually entitled Shapeshifters.
Right. Makes sense.
All right. So, dude, yeah, just anyway, so yeah, dude, yeah, you can shoehorn it in. But like, okay, Hooli, from a, if you're wanting to use these talents in your games, talk to me character option. Talk to me about character options and GM options here. If I'm a character and what's going to work best for me as a concept if I want to use these talents.
Yeah. So obviously when we start talking about the abilities that they're going to get, mechanically speaking, the character who is a melee machine is going to really benefit from this and, may even actively seek that talent out. I think that this sort of talent works best if it's purchased at the start. And I think that that's something that we see Scott Zumwalt do on Something Strange. You really need to impose this talent at the start of the campaign where a PC's backstory indicates that, that they've been bitten by a werewolf or have always been a werewolf as part of some sort of a clan or something like that. Or even perhaps that that they don't even know that, that they are some sort of vicious creature like a half vampire or something like that. I guess what I'm trying to say is that have the PCs make it be part of the character's backstory. And then when they want to purchase the talent as well, because, having characters with that talent at the start should be part of their backstory. And likewise, if they, if they want to purchase it during the story, have them give a reason why. And it could be for any reason, but it really does need to be some sort of a reason for having this ability in the first place. And that's something which is really important, I think. Otherwise, the talent doesn't make sense. And this talent is really only for Weird War anyway. But as we're sort of like pointing out, that it does expand beyond that. But anyway, I got sidetracked. So where was I? Oh, that's right. The melee machine. Now, when we talk about the melee machine and what they can get out of this talent, we've got in amongst there, we've got the second wind of strain recovery that I mentioned before, that, you might have 15 strain threshold and then suddenly you drop and then all of a sudden it's back up again. It doesn't say that it does that to your wounds. So you're going to be wanting to be dodging out of the way and hopefully, have a good soak and things like that. But it also provides an extra boost to brawn and a natural attack as well. And that's massive, especially if you've, you're into brawling or into some sort of melee. It's absolutely amazing. And, you don't care about the lack of magic or ranged attacks really if you're the melee combatant, because the chances are that, most magic users aren't going to be the sort of characters that are going to be getting into the thick of it, which is what these sort of characters really are. And, also the physically weaker, for example, like, your egghead type characters, they really have a 5 XP method to become a terrifying physical combatant when the chips are really down. So if you've got a scenario where everybody's out for the count, and suddenly the only person that's left is the spellcaster, and they're out of strain, run into battle, get hit, hopefully, or go and take an extra melee or whatever else and get that strain down to 0, and then all of a sudden it's back up again.
Yeah.
You can't be casting any more spells, but again, it's sort of to go back to that second wind type of scenario. You've suddenly gone from a magic blasting range combatant to a melee combatant. And if you've got all of the NPCs that are sort of, right, he's running away, and he's keeping his distance, so we're going to go over to bows and arrows. Well, if you're suddenly moving into close combat, they're going to have to be swapping weapons, and that means, especially when we're talking about minions, is that they're going to run out of things to do before you can get in there and start hacking and slashing. So yeah.
You know, I think of Bruce Banner.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. You talk. You know, you're this egghead scientist, and you're this little wimpy dude. It's like you wouldn't like me when I'm angry. and when he gets pushed, he just Now, I saw some discussion online around somebody exploring the possibility of saying, you know, well, I don't like the fact that you can't cast spells. You know, would it be okay to house rule this where you can still cast spells? Short answer, no. Highly do not recommend that.
No.
if you really want to go for a druidic character, there are some wonderful talents in the expanded player's guide that will let you do that and handle that type of shape changing with still retaining a modicum of magical capability. But those talents are costed appropriately. This is not to be able to do that because strain explosion and strain depletion is one of the balancing aspects of the magic system in Genesys. So if I can take a 5 XP talent that will let me spam a bunch of spells and then come back up and spam a bunch of more, that becomes broken.
Yeah.
So do not recommend that at all. But
because that's one interesting thing that you're suggesting there, Chris, as well, is that if you're running a superhero campaign, something simple like this represents the Hulk really, really well. Obviously it's not the capabilities of the Hulk, right? But you know, at least narratively speaking. Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a lot about character options, though, Chris. What about GM options? What are some of the things that can be done that way?
Oh man, well, honestly, you kind of hinted at it earlier. Giving Shapeshifter to a threat, I think, is a fantastic and scary idea. You know, when the threat is down, at least from strain, they come back up and just wear out. Okay, Hulk out. That can be really fun in an encounter. Just make sure you plan for that appropriately when you come to designing the threats in the encounter. And I don't know, man, my brain goes to all kinds of things with a GM. If you have this kind of thing, if you have shape-shifting in your world, in your setting, develop some organizations, both maybe benevolent or malicious, around the concept that you can populate your campaign with. You know, the Brotherhood of Shifters, right? You know, where those that are, you know, maybe banding together for survival, and maybe others who are more nefarious and are like, you know, yes, we can use this power. You know, I think of, for those who've played Elder Scrolls Skyrim, the Companion Guild, the Companions, where all the top members are all freaking werewolves, you know, and that's like a secret, you know, but it's their juice. It's what gives them their power and their moxie, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, you could have a lot of fun with it. I mean, what about you as a GM? How do you see fitting this in?
Well, one of the things that I've actually done myself, mainly with Pathfinder, but I can certainly see it coming across over to this, using this talent specifically, is Pathfinder had an adventure path called Carrion Crown. It was very sort of horror-filled, and they sort of looked at every single possible, you know, horror trope that they could throw in. And there was a section, I think it was the middle adventure, and it was probably one of my favorites, where they've gone through this really deep sort of dark forest. And there was a lodge in the middle of the forest, in the middle of nowhere. Spoilers for anyone who hasn't yet played this, but you know, go and check it out. It is really good. Anyway, so in amongst all of this, there was this clan war that was going on with several groups of different types of werewolves. You know, there were the evil ones that were all about you know, turning people and then enslaving them. And having fun with them while they're watching them turn. There were groups that were actually lawful good, for those who are familiar with D&D. That you know, they were a noble family of wolves, that they didn't believe in tainting the bloodline at all. So there's all sorts of things that you can do with feuds. I mean, we've got werewolf, the apocalypse as well. that you can draw from for the sort of stories. What's another movie that Underworld had a great idea behind, the werewolves and the vampires. So there's all sorts of things that they can do. It's amazing.
Yeah, there's so much. And when we talk about so much, you hinted at this before, Uli, but we need to call it out. A major shout out is needed. We really can't have a conversation about these talents. We would be very remiss if we didn't also talk about the amazing werewolf talent sets that are available, actually both in Scott Zumwalt's Something Strange setting, and then also replicated in Guillaume Tardif's Inquisition setting.
Yeah.
If these two talents, Shapeshifter and Shapeshifter Improved, just don't cut it for you, if you really want to expand lycanthropy and shapeshifting as a primary focal point of your campaign and your world, a major set of real character options that a PC can legitimately build their entire concept around, their entire talent set around, then guys, you should just simply purchase one of those settings from the Foundry and you should call it a day. Okay. They have scores of talents that give real teeth, no pun intended, to this kind of concept. And for that and many other reasons, those are both really good products that are well worth the buy. Yeah. So if this isn't enough for you, we recommend that you really go there.
Yeah.
If you really want to detail this out, because they've done all the hard work, they've done all the play testing, and they're great talent. The werewolf talent set's amazing. It's really well done.
Now, one of the things, and we're sort of going off show notes here a little bit, but one of the things that I've seen mentioned in the past, especially when it comes to GMs, is how do you handle, as far as like power levels or whatever else, how do you handle characters that are wanting to become a shapeshifter? There's it always used to be a classic trope in D&D that you'd have some player who was just hell-bent on becoming a werewolf, and all that he would do would just run around the forest any time that they could to try to find a werewolf just so that they could get bit. I don't get the sense of why, but it's out there.
I do. You get. I don't know. It's attractive.
Especially with the special abilities and stuff like that. Sure, I get that.
That's exactly what I mean. The talent doesn't have this, but there's no reason you can't do it as a GM. If a character is taking this talent at character creation, they're going to have a backstory as to how they have the shapeshifting capability. Yep. If it's a case of lycanthropy, maybe they were born with it, maybe they were bitten in their youth or previously. Maybe that's the reason they had to leave their small hamlet and go become an adventurer, right? And they're considered a curse they're dealing with, or an ability they're still struggling to master.
Yep.
If somebody wants to take it later on in their career, you are well within your rights as a GM to be like, okay, well, you need to contract it somehow. You need to get bitten, okay, by the appropriate thing, or you need to be cursed, okay? Yep. Something to that effect. You need to go piss off a gypsy, okay, and right, and get cursed, or whatever it may be. But enforcing that narrative catalyst. This is one of those few talents that you can legitimately force a narrative prerequisite for. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. But I think that one of the things that concerned people, or GM specifically, is that how do you handle that in game? Because these sorts of things can effectively, as we've talked about already, where it's doubling that strain threshold. How do you deal with that in game? And I think that you just have to play it by ear. But the other thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't heal wounds. I said that earlier. That sure, you can have, as much strain as you want, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to, be hacked to pieces and then get up and walk again. Just because you're alive. It really is a case that you need to couple that with something like regeneration as an ability.
Yeah.
Now, if you've got a character who has regeneration because of the species that you've designed, You really need to think about how you're going to do that. And if it really does start to break the game or whatever else, and because you can throw additional bad guys and, additional minion groups, but you have to take into consideration the other players as well. And they may be overwhelmed because of the scenario that you're in. And suddenly you've just got, 4 or 5 of these minion groups attacking a small group of, a rogue and a magic user and a cleric type thing. That if they're not prepared for that, you might be able to survive for a little bit longer. But there's just something to consider there as well. What's your thoughts on that, Chris?
No, I agree. I mean, it's just something you kind of have to play it by ear and be conscious about. If you're going to include this ability in your game, you have to be ready for it. Yeah. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
But Hilda, you bring up a good point. Bad guys rarely attack your strain. Okay.
Pretty much.
So it's not so much that you need to worry about, basically having an extra PC in the party, meaning somebody goes down and gets back up. It's honestly, I would be a little more worried about, or I would be more prepared around the PC that's taken improved. So I know, oh boy, he's going to get an extra die to those pools, when he hulks out. Okay. That's kind of what you got to think about and keep in the back of your mind. But again, the system is flexible enough that it'll work just fine. Yeah. It really will.
But these are only 2 talents. And as we like to do, we would be remiss if we didn't throw our own custom talents into the ring, of course. But these few new talent options are by no means as detailed as the werewolf talents in Something Strange and Inquisition. They've been designed to follow the same generic simplicity of the 2 core talents that we see in Realms of Terranoth. But if you're a fan of Shapeshifter, these new options might give you, that were character that you've always wanted to be playing a little bit more of an oomph.
So 3 new talents we have for you guys, and we're eager for you to get them on the playtest table. The first one is Shapeshifter Brute. Tier 2. Activation passive, non-ranked. Your character must have purchased the Shapeshifter talent to benefit from this talent.
Yep.
While shapeshifted, your natural attacks gain an additional +1 damage, as well as the Pierce 1 and Vicious 1 qualities. Yeah.
That could be nasty. But I like it.
I mean, and definitely I think well costed at 10 XP.
Yep.
But it's one of those things also that, you don't have to have the improved, because it's one of those things that you're an enhanced shifter. Okay. Yep. Whether this is an intentional shift on your part or not, when you shift, you're going to be a lot more nasty, at least in terms of being that brute of damage dealing. You've got longer claws or sharper teeth or whatever it is. So, yeah.
So our next one is Shapeshifter Heritage. So it's a tier 2. Its activation is passive. It's non-ranked. Your character must have purchased the Shapeshifter talent to benefit from this talent. When you purchase this talent, select one of the abilities below. While shapeshifted, your character gains this extra ability. So there are 4 different things that you can choose from. And the first one is Beast Hide, where your character increases their melee and range defense by 1, an excellent addition. Night Vision, your character ignores any setback on skill checks due to darkness or low light. Nimble, your character does not suffer strain to take a second maneuver on their turn, an insane ability. And Scent, your character gains 2 boost die on any check made to track a target where your character can reasonably follow the target's scent or unique smell. Great talent. And remember, you can only choose it once, and you get your choice of any of these 4. And, some people may say that for a tier 2, you get 2 boost die. Remember that you do have to have the Shapeshifter talent and everything else that goes along with it.
Plus, it's 2 boost die in a very limited circumstance.
Exactly. So it's not as bad. I'm more scared about Nimble, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. I like this talent. The idea of when again, because we have to, you compare it to Dungeons and Dragons, where you have all these different types of were creature templates that each provide some type of subtly different special ability, right?
Right.
So how can you represent that? Well, you can do it with this shapeshifter heritage. It's like, okay, well, narratively, I'm a werebear. Okay, so I take this talent and I have beast hide. Okay, narratively, I'm a were-rat, so I have this night vision, or I'm a werewolf, so I have nimble. Okay, or scent might be a better one, right? And that's that's it's just kind of one way to kind of represent that narratively and add a nice little mechanical benefit. So yeah,
I agree. It's very, very cool. And I mean, if you wanted to go down the path, you could all look at something like a were-hare or a were-rabbit. I know that's weird, but something like that. Were-gazelle. I'm just going crazy now.
Like I say were-rabbit, I think of Wallace and Gromit. That's all I can think of.
Yes, I agree. So you could add on additional abilities there if you wanted to. They can only still select this talent once, but if you wanted to have something similar to parkour or improve parkour, you could be adding in something like that as well to your campaign too. So yeah, just a couple of things. Yeah, absolutely.
You want to hear? So you want to hear my impression of Gromit?
Go on.
Okay, here you go. What do you think?
You're an idiot. I think we've got another talent, Chris.
We do. Our last custom talent, Shapeshifter Supreme. So we have a base talent. We have an improved talent. I had to come up with a Supreme version of the talent, right?
Right.
Now, considering the benefit of it, as we'll come to in a moment, the base talent is tier 1. The improved version is tier 2. First off, when we were designing, we made this talent tier 3, and then we took a look at what it does and realized that was a bit undercosted. So it is a tier 4.
Yep.
It is active, incidental, non-ranked, and of course, your character must have purchased the Shapeshifter improved talent to benefit from this talent. So you recall what Shapeshifter improved does, Hooli, right?
Right. It allows you to choose whether you change or not. Well, at least gives you the ability to make a check to see whether you choose.
Exactly. And you could do that once per session, and it was a hard discipline check.
Right.
With Shapeshifter Supreme, using the Shapeshifter improved talent now requires only an average, that's 2 purple discipline check, as an out-of-turn incidental, and may be attempted once per encounter instead of once per session.
Wow. That's insane. And
well, it's tier 4, man.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I mean, the quote that comes to mind is, do you want to know my secret? I'm always angry. So, from, what was that from? That was from the first Avengers, I think it was, from the Hulk. So, yeah, this is a really interesting, I mean, it's adding on from the previous improved version. Makes it just that little bit easier. Obviously everything that we do is non-play tested. This is just done in a vacuum between Chris and I. So, try it out. See what you think. Is it a tier 4? Is it a tier 3? I definitely don't think it's a tier 3. But, but perhaps it may be a tier 5. I don't know. Try it out at home and let us know. We're keen to get this feedback. And, as people would have seen, I am playing catch up with the notes. So, take a look at those. We will have them available for after this episode with these talents. So take a look and let us know.
And where can people find those notes with these talents, Hooli?
Well, they can just go to our website, which is forgegenesis.com, and go to the resource section, and it's right at the top, listed in numerical order, so it's pretty easy to find. So go and take a look. And I'm pretty happy with the way they're turning out, actually.
Ooh, I am too. Especially the last few you published, they've been very well done.
Yeah.
So,
thank you.
I love it. So good discussion, guys. And if you have any requests that you'd like us to really tackle, whether that be a talent or a particular skill in the Stoking the Fire segment, let us know. We'll have contact information at the end of the show, but the easiest way is to request it on social media, any social media platform. Just search for @ForgeGenesis. And with that, Hooli, I think it's time to pump the bellows and heat things up as we open up the furnace.
The Furnace.
And welcome to The Furnace, the segment where we take a deep dive into a topic concerning custom creations using the Genesys Role Playing Game. Tonight we're diving into the penultimate episode of what will become our 6-part discussion on Magic System in Genesys. We first covered the basic principles of Magic in episode 8, De-mystifying the Mystical, part 1, and we continued that discussion in episode 10, De-mystifying the Mystical 2, Electric Boogaloo. And after you understood all of that, we finally began tackling the reskinning of the Magic System entirely with episode 12, Demystifying the Mystical 3, Beyond Thunderdome, where we walked through the basic tenets of reskinning the Magic System by creating a reskin of our own live on the show with a new system for post-apocalyptic mutations. We then continued that with episode 14, Demystifying the Mystical 4, So Long and Thanks for All the Mutations, looking at detailing out all of our spells, or as we dub them, powers.
And in those last 2 Magic episodes, we talked about the first 4 steps of Magic reskin. 1, roughing out the concept. 2, defining your skills. 3, defining your spells and talents, all of which were covered in episode 12. And then 4, detailing your spells, which was episode 14, as Hooli said. And we did this while building out our Magic reskin of post-apocalyptic mutations. But tonight, we're going to tackle steps 5 and 6 of the reskin process. Step 5, detailing out your talents, and step 6, defining your penalties and your threat and despair results. Outside of implements, which will be our final magical episode in this series, this is really it when it comes to reskinning Magic.
And as a continual reminder, as Chris said, we've spent 4 whole episodes talking about how Magic works and kicking off our reskinning task. As such, it goes without saying that before you listen to this episode, you really need to have listened to episodes 8, 10, 12, and 14. That's hours of listening pleasure, and while everybody's tied up with Corona and you have to stay at home, give those a listen. There you go. But you need to listen to all of those for it all to make sense of much of what we're going to cover tonight and the logic behind our decisions. We're going to proceed assuming that you've already got those episodes under your belt and pick up right where episode 14 left off. Now, if you haven't caught up, be sure to give those episodes a listen, as I said, before you continue with this episode. Otherwise, you're probably going to get a little bit lost.
Well, let's get right into it and continue with the reskin, folks, because we got a few very important things to get to as we cap off the reskin of post-apocalyptic mutations. But first, boilerplate.
It almost needs a title within itself, doesn't it? Like a little soundbite. But anyway,
well, I can do like the boilerplate.
Love it.
Boilerplate. Oh, that one's different. Hell now. Oh, hell.
Oh my God. You see what I got to put up with, listeners? Anyway.
Yeah.
So the first rule of all of this is playtest, playtest, playtest. You know, we've said this in episode 12 and in episode 14, but we're going to say it again because of how important it is. What we're creating with this post-apocalyptic mutation reskin of Genesys Magic is a draft. We are creating it live as an example and teaching tool, but it is not ready to be played yet or is fit for a public table. We don't say public consumption because we want you to listen to this episode and we want you to really go through all of the notes that we've created for it when it goes live. Because all of this stuff has not been play tested more than anything else. Such deep new systems must be play tested as much as you can manage. This is not negotiable. So just so that we're clear, I'll say it again. It's not ready for a public table yet. It's not ready to be played. Take a look at it. Give us feedback. We really, really want it. We'll talk more about that at the end of the segment. So, just keep that in mind, that this is a huge multi-episode creation effort. And it will still hinge on ultimate refinements and changes that have to come after playtesting.
Indeed. So shall we review very quickly, back in episode 12 and 14, we began the process of a fresh, new reskin, turning magic into post-apocalyptic mutations. We went through the first 3 steps. Step 1, rough out your concept. We define mutations and what they were conceptually. Step 2, define your skills. We decided, Huli, on 3 skills, did we not?
That's right. We listed psionics, which was presence-based, and that's used for psychic powers. We had metabolics, which is a willpower-based skill, and it's used for bodily mutations that are going to enhance what the body already does naturally. And then our last skill was aberrantics, which is a cunning-based, and it's used for physical mutations that provide entirely new non-natural capabilities. In other words, the weird.
Exactly. Step 3 we went through, which was to define your spells and your talents. From the key effects that we identified back in step 1, when we roughed out the concept, we settled on the very specific concrete effects that we wanted represented in our spells, which we then rechristened as powers, and what we kind of also wanted to see in our talents.
Yep.
Then we did step 4, which was last episode, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was to detail out the spells. So in our case, powers. We went hardcore and fully designed and fleshed out the base effects, both narrative and in structured encounters, of each of the powers and the additional effect tables for each and every one. So these powers that we've created are block, which is used by metabolics and psionics. It's a defensive power similar to the barrier spell. We had enhance, which is metabolics only. And it's a self-buffing power similar to how the augment spell works. We then had strike, which is aberrantics and psionics, and it's a, deal damage to others' power. Obviously, it's similar to the attack spell. And what were the others, Chris?
Well, we had survive, could be manifested with aberrantics or metabolics. It was a brand new power with aspects of the heal spell, but most importantly, especially when it comes to the additional effects, was really about reducing or ignoring dangerous environmental conditions. Then we had the telekinesis power, which could only be accessed with psionics, which was a brand new power, reskinned from the brand new telekinesis spell that we created on the air in episode 8. And then we had the last power, which was called weird, aberrantics only. And it's a generalist power, very similar to the utility spell. In terms of the things it can do. Yep. And that's really got a 1-minute summary of 3 hours of conversation last episode. Quite amazing.
Absolutely. So we now have to go through step 5, as we've said before, which is detail out the talents. So now that we've finished step 4, detailing out your spells in episode 14, it's time for us to really go in and detail out the talents and how they're going to work in with the powers that we've created. Now, it's important to note, as we said back in episode 12, that these steps are not always sequential. Yes, we are doing it that way because it makes better radio. But in reality, you are often tackling them both at the same time because one informs the other and vice versa.
Absolutely. So the first thing to do in detailing out your talents is to go all the way back to step 1 and review the original concepts you came up with. Now is that time to go back, review all the ideas and abilities that you laid out. All the things you wanted your power source to accomplish. Because when it comes to talents that are related to your reskin of magic, they should typically focus on one of 2 things, okay? The first thing is the talent typically will either modify or enhance the usage of spells, okay, in our case, powers, all right? Remember, talents like this are designed typically to break the balanced choices that you made in core mechanical design. Talents are what allow exceptions to the balanced rules you created. That's the point of a talent. Why do we let PCs break those beautifully balanced rules? Because they paid good XP to do it. That's what a talent is, okay?
Yep.
The second thing for these types of talents is, okay, first category is they're either going to modify or enhance the usage of your spells, okay, or in our case, powers.
Yep.
The second category is they're going to provide generic or static benefits related to your power source specifically. This is for those times that you want your power source, magic, in our case, mutation, to provide a benefit that is not something a normal person could do. You have to be magical to do it, or in our case, you have to be mutated to do it.
Yep.
But it isn't as powerful or, quite frankly, discrete as an actual spell, or in our case, power. I mean, does that make sense, Huli?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you'll hear, no doubt, our talents are no exception, and they do follow this. Also, when it comes to creating our own talents for a reskin, the following precepts are those we consider to be best practices, and boy, are they going to sound familiar. So what's our first one, Chris?
Beg, borrow, and steal. Literally, this means you guys are going to see this with our talents that we did for mutations. This literally means filing the serial numbers off of an existing talent. Existing talents have already been play tested. They have already been balanced. Why fix what isn't broken? Change as little as you can. Gamers and aspiring designers have a huge problem with this. They see an existing talent. They're like, oh, I like that, but I'm going to make a quick change to it. It's like, why? It's one less thing you don't have to be worried about playtesting to the same degree, man.
Yep.
Why?
There's no reason for it. No reason whatsoever.
No reason. No reason. So yeah, number one, beg, borrow, and steal.
Yep. So change as little as you can. It's as simple as that. The second rule for this is the KISS theory, which I always use. So keep it simple, stupid. So, I don't know why, but gamers have a wonderful habit of overcomplicating things for the sake of being hyper accurate or to account for every scenario possible. It is in human nature. I guess it is in gaming nature to do these sorts of things. But if you can simplify a talent by hand waving away edge case scenarios, then do it. Simpler is going to be better. If there are going to be those, side issues that pop up, that's stuff that the GM can rule on the fly. They should be running their games with a no open book policy anyway, that they shouldn't need to be book diving. It's as simple as that. Let them sort of detail out and then start to make a ruling. And then at the end of the session, you can start doing things like, okay, let's have a discussion about that and let's make a ruling on it. Simpler is going to be better.
Absolutely. And then the third and final best practice rule of thumb when it comes to talent creation. Number 3, don't go crazy. We were speaking to a listener a while back, not directly. He posed a question to us, if you recall.
Yeah.
That we had in the Under the Hammer segment.
Mm-hmm.
And the listener had created over 100 talents for his setting.
Yeah.
That's just too much.
Yeah.
First of all, you can't reasonably play test all of that, not accurately.
No.
Not if you want to release the product anytime soon. Second of all, your players are just going to experience overload. They're not going to read all that. They're just not.
Mm-hmm.
The books already have scores of talents. I mean, look, and to put this in context, even the Expanded Player's Guide, a published generic book with a dedicated chapter entirely on magic. Do you know how many new magic-focused talents it introduced, Huli?
There was, from my understanding, there was only 20 magic-focused talents.
Oh, 20?
Only 20. It's like Realms of Terranoth. It only had 12 talents dealing with actually using magic. And that book introduced both runic and verse casting. So, so there isn't a reason to, as you say, go crazy. You don't need that. Your sweet spot should be about a dozen or fewer talents that relate to your reskin. Maybe a few more than that, maybe a few less, but maybe. Maybe.
The the key thing to remember is that we're talking about talents that are specific to the magic reskin, though, right?
Right.
Not the setting as a whole that you are likely to be putting those talents in.
Right.
Okay. In the case of a brand new setting, you want to shoot for typically under 20 new talents, 20 to 30. That's kind of what we talked about. Okay. And that's for a comprehensive, 100-page setting compendium. So consider that. Do you really want 50 to 75% of the new talents in your setting to be focused on the magic reskin that you have as a part of that setting?
No.
Okay. So consider that as well. I mean, and yet, who's got the crux of it? 12 is the magic number, or less. Again, don't go crazy. Keep it simple, stupid, and beg, borrow, and steal.
Yeah. So now that we know our talents for post-apocalyptic mutations are going to be in one of two categories, let's apply those best practices and share with you what we've actually come up with. So the first one that we came up with is we'll actually go through these in tiers. It's probably the easiest way.
Yeah.
So for the tier 1 talent is Aberrantic Insight. So it's a tier 1, as I said. Activation is active incidental, and it's non-ranked. And it says, when a mutation power you manifest with Aberrantics adds a quality to your character's power with a rating determined by your character's ranks in discipline, your character may use their ranks in survival instead. Now, this is a reskin of the Dark Insight talent from Realms of Terranoth. And it's a talent that breaks the advice we gave that led to the determination to use discipline for additional effects in the first place. And really, that's the point. It only applies to aberrantic powers. And, survival made the most sense, as it's still not overpowered as far as a secondary skill option goes.
Yeah.
So, to me, this is a nice talent that sort of allows if you're a character that has really sort of focused on survival, and let's face it, in this sort of an environment, in this post-apocalyptic setting, chances are that survival is going to be a very, very useful skill for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that same vein, we had Aberrantic Insight. We then have Metabolic Insight. Same thing. Tier 1, active activation, incidental, non-ranked. And when mutation power you manifest with metabolics adds a quality to your character's power with a rating determined by discipline, your character may instead use their ranks in resilience. So it's the same thing as Aberrantic Insight, but it's for metabolic powers specifically. And you're replacing that secondary skill for additional effects is now, instead of discipline, it can be resilience.
Yeah.
And again, same reskin. Only applies to metabolic powers. And resilience made sense. Again, as that's still not overpowered secondary skill option.
Yeah.
When you think about the characteristics that are commonly associated with these skills, discipline's a tough one. It's a tough one for everyone but psionics. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like, if you're an aberrantic user or a metabolic mutant, uses metabolics, it's like, God, discipline, really? Well, I guess I'm never adding those additional effects. This is what, we have that there for balance reasons. But you know what? You throw 5 XP at this, and you can break that a little bit, and maybe go for ranks that you're in a skill you're more likely to take. Okay,
agree.
So
very, very good. And of course, we would be amiss if we didn't have one for psionics as well, where we've created Psionic Insight. And to that end, we created Psionic Insight. Now, like its siblings, it's a tier 1 talent. Its activation is active incidental, and it's non-ranked. And again, same process as before, that when a mutation power you manifest with psionics adds a quality to your character's power with a rating determined by your character's ranks in discipline, your character may use their cool instead, which, that sort of makes sense to me as well. And cool is also a skill that doesn't get used very often.
Yeah.
Everybody's always, into the whole vigilance type thing. But cool is something that, you're going to have to be keeping really sort of focused. And, cool makes the most sense, especially if you're dealing with everything around you and you have to keep hyper-focused because this is a mental power that you're utilizing.
Yeah.
So, definitely.
Yeah, it made good sense. And so those 3 tier 1 talents really fall into that first category of talents that we talked about, where basically you're modifying or enhancing the usage of spells. The last tier 1 talent we have really falls into the second category, which is the generic or the static benefit related to the power source. And this one came right out of our step 1 discussions, if you remember, Huli. This is healing factor.
Yeah.
Tier 1, activation passive, and it is a ranked talent. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
When your character has a full night's rest, in addition to the 1 wound healed, your character heals 2 additional wounds for each rank of this talent. So this was not a reskin. This was a brand new talent we crafted that's really designed to represent passive mutant healing capability.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have the survive power. It can be used to heal. But even if you don't have ranks in any of the mutation skills that could give you access to the survive power, which is just metabolics or aberrantics, you could still be a mutant. And you can have a mutant healing factor, a mutation. And this is really what that kind of represents.
Yep.
And, if you play that, I think it's actually fairly well costed. If you get 5 ranks in this, yeah, man, you'd be healing an extra 10 wounds a night. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, you've paid for a tier 1, a tier 2, a tier 3, a tier 4, and a tier 5 talent. Not to mention the pyramid underneath that you need to get all the way there.
Absolutely. So it may seem like 2 wounds, that's huge. But when you also think about it, if you've got somebody who, in a fantasy campaign, they can keep pumping out healing as much as they want. And if they rest overnight, so they can spend all of their strain to heal everybody in the party. And then they rest overnight. And all of the meat shields, they all keep watch while the magic user or the cleric or whatever that has heal, that they can rest. And so they've got all their strain back for the following day. So this is just an interesting way to, as you say, Chris, to give mutants just that little bit of a helping hand.
Give a helping hand. Oh, yeah. I liked it. It seemed very flavorful as well.
Yeah.
And especially when you talk about the theme that we went for post-apocalyptic, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And even leaving the reskin and talking about the setting as a whole, this focus on self-reliance, okay? The lone wasteland survivor wandering, I don't know, it seemed very fitting.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, like anything, and this is something that I think every single product that I've ever seen on the Foundry say, that if you want to, beg, borrow, and steal from these other supplements, this is a great one if you're wanting to do a superhero setting where you've got someone who has a high healing factor that isn't necessarily regeneration as such, that where they don't have to rest. But certainly this sort of thing would apply to superheroes who don't have regeneration as part of their, like the Flash, for example. His is speed related because of his metabolism.
Yeah.
But you can have healing factor and you just have a narrative sort of feel to it.
Yeah, this is a good, the Flash would just have this talent with several ranks in it, basically.
Yeah.
The guy's basically fully healed after a night's rest when you get down to it.
Yeah.
He's not Wolverine, okay?
No.
That would be very, very different. But yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay, does this bring us to our tier 2 talents?
It does. So our first tier 2 is evolved mutation. So its activation is passive. It's not a ranked talent. And it says when your character gains this talent, decide on 1 evolved mutation power for them, consisting of a particular mutation power action and a specific set of 1 or more effects. Does this sound familiar? When your character manifests the evolved mutation, consisting of the exact combination of action and effects previously chosen, reduce the difficulty of the check by 1. This is a straight reskin of Signature Spell from Realms of Terranoth. And, we did mention it last episode, and I think, we talked about how we would do that. Well, this is how it's done.
Yeah, and, with Signature Spell, it represents, listen, this is a spell, this is a particular recipe that you know like the back of your hand.
Yeah.
You have practiced it to the point that it's second nature. So guess what? You get to reduce the difficulty, but only for that exact recipe. How do you represent that? It's a great mechanic that we wanted to represent with mutations. How do you represent that with post-apocalyptic mutations? You make it an evolved mutation, right?
Yeah.
You do this. You have evolved this particular mutation. You do it extremely well.
Yeah.
So, and this definitely falls into that first category of obviously of talents. But our next tier 2 falls into the second category, where it's not directly related to casting or the in our case manifesting these powers. It's a static ability, and we call this one latent mutant. Tier 2 again, passive activation, non-ranked. Select one mutation skill: aberrantics, metabolics, or psionics. That skill and discipline are now career skills for your character. This is appropriate to account for characters that are basically becoming mutants later in life. Okay.
Yeah.
Or having these powers manifest in some way. To keep it balanced, it only provides a career skill access to one power skill. And even if you compare this to similar talents that they have for magic, it only gives you access to one magic skill and the default secondary skill for additional effects. In our case, discipline. It's also going to cost 10 XP and a tier 2 talent to get this. I mean, and for a comparison and a bit of a reskin, I mean, this is very similar in flavor to the Bard and Runic Lore talents from Realms of Tyranoth.
And, looking at it, it is possible that, if, depending on how we would do, if we were doing this as a complete setting, and it may be something that we discuss later on in future episodes, but if you were designing your species or your archetypes for this particular setting, or even your careers, you may have, only one of those skills that's attached to that particular, whether it be a career, whether it be a species. And so this is giving you access to a second one, which may open some interesting options for you to be that little bit more versatile.
Yep.
But it's a great, for this setting, it's absolutely fantastic. And I can sort of see it being used in other settings as well. And I know I keep going back to it, but, a superhero setting would be absolutely fantastic if you've sort of got a character who has, like an Iron Man sort of person that has absolutely no, mutant powers or any sort of thing like that. But then after exposure to the arc reactor that he has in his chest, suddenly starts developing some sort of powers.
That's a bit of a stretch. Why don't you go for the easy one, man? You have an adventuring party of a brilliant scientist, his brilliant scientist's wife, his bodyguard test pilot, or his bodyguard buddy, and her brother, the test pilot. And they're a really cool adventuring party, and they're astronauts. And then they get exposed to strange cosmic rays. And they become Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman and the Human Torch and the Thing.
Very true. Look, you could also look at this from if you were porting Star Wars across. Yeah. You could almost say that this is Force sensitivity as well. If that's the direction you were going to go in and doing your skills that way. Yeah. That's another process as well. Yeah. Interesting.
Although I would do it but differently from Star Wars because
sure.
I mean, and that would come into the design, the whole process that we've gone through. This only gives you access to one skill as career skills.
Yeah, true.
If you're getting into, but then again, that actually might be totally worthwhile because if I was to create a career for a Jedi, they would probably have access to any Force-related skills that we've developed.
Yep.
So, no, I take that back. Okay.
All right, so our next one is mutant training. It's tier 2. Its activation is active incidental. It's non-ranked. When your character manifests a mutation power, you may spend one story point to use this talent to add a single advantage equal to your character's ranks in discipline to the results. So it's a reskin of Brilliant Casting Talent from the EPG, and really fits that sort of that theme of the powers, and that you've managed to work out the best course of using your own abilities to be able to power some of the effects that you've added.
Yeah. And that's reflected again in discipline. So if you get that up there and you've got 3 ranks in discipline, pop a story point, boom, 3 advantage to the results. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love brilliant casting. It's a great talent.
Very much so. Well, what's our last one, Chris?
Our last one for tier 2 is Wasteland Mutant. Again, tier 2, activation passive. This is a ranked talent. Your character gains a boost die per rank of this talent on any non-mutation skill check made to avoid or reduce the effects of radiation, contamination, toxic atmospheres, and similar post-apocalyptic environmental hazards per GM discretion. So this is that second category of talents, right? Again, you have some mutation capability, but it's not manifested in powers. Now, it was very important when we created this talent. This is brand new out of whole cloth, representing, again, those minor mutations that aren't so flashy, but they're just, in this setting, would be all too common mutations. That your wasteland mutants are going to have to deal with irradiated food and water, to deal with biological contaminations, or just other random wasteland hazards that are going to be out there. And it's important to note that for balance, it was very clear the boost die is only gained on non-mutation skill checks made to avoid or reduce the effects of these things, because the survive power is a skill check made to avoid or reduce the effects of some of these things, okay? But that is obviously a mutation skill check, okay? So this would come into play when you're making that survival check. This would come into play when you're making that perception check or that resilience check, okay, to avoid those things. And it's just popping you boost dice per rank. And it starts at tier 2, so it's not like it's a 5 XP, to start it off with, okay?
Yeah.
It's reminiscent to me, Hooli, of there was a series of Star Wars talents of various stripes. They were like, here, you get a boost die. Each rank gives you a boost die to your vigilance. You remember those? Each rank gives you a boost die to your perception, right?
Yeah.
So very similar in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that, and this is something which we don't see much, but ranked talents that are not just tier 1. Which was something we felt that was important to have in this range of talents as well. So very, very cool. All right, so that's all of our tier 1s and 2s done. So let's move over to tier 3. So the first one is healing factor improved. So if we remember back to the tier 1, which for the healing factor, which is when your character has a full night's rest, in addition to 1 wound healed, your character heals an additional 2 wounds for each rank in the talent. Okay, so for this one, tier 3, activation is passive and it's non-ranked. So your character must have purchased at least 1 rank in the healing factor talent to benefit from this talent. And it says, when your character has a full night's rest, they may attempt a resilience check to recover from 1 critical injury. This check is performed using the same difficulty as the weekly check detailed on page 116 of the Genesys core rules. It's a brand new talent, and it's designed to represent the passive mutant healing capability. And it's a nice addition to the original tier 1 talent. What are your thoughts on this one, Chris?
Well, I think about the Flash once again, right? I mean, a full night's rest, he's recovered all his new ones, right? Well, every episode of the Flash, he stumbles and he breaks his arm, okay? Or you shattered your patella, or you always suffer some horrible critical injury, and it's like, but you'll be fine in the morning, right?
Yeah,
that's because Barry, has improved healing factor as the Flash, so he's able to roll that resilience check. And those occasional episodes where he was like, blind for like 2 days or wheelchair bound for like 6 or 7 days, it's like, well, dude, you quit failing your resilience check, right? That's what it is. But, I thought it was a nice bump up. If healing factor lets you, heal at, essentially, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times the normal rate, improved healing factor lets you heal critical injuries at, again, 7 times the normal rate.
Yep.
Yeah. And our last tier 3 is Steady Mutant. Again, tier 3, passive activation, non-ranked. Your character does not add setback dice to mutation skill checks for distraction or being encumbered.
Mm.
So we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves because we haven't quite gotten to step 6 yet, which details out, our penalties for casting. But this talent is designed to play with that, and is very much inspired by the battle casting talent from Realms of Tyrannoth.
Yep, very cool. All right, so that's all about tier 3s done. So now we'll talk about tier 4. And our first one is Evolved Mutation Improved. So it's a tier 4, as I said. Activation is passive, and it's non-ranked. Now, your character must have purchased the Evolved Mutation talent to benefit from this talent. And when your character manifests their Evolved Mutation, reduce the difficulty of the check by 2 instead of 1. Now, this is a straight reskin, as we said before, of, the first one was Signature Spell. Well, this is a straight reskin of Improved Signature Spell, both of those from Realms of Tyrannoth. And we also spoke about those way back in, I think it was episode 11. I'm not sure. Or maybe it was 10. I can't remember now. But anyway. So, yeah, take a look at that. But yeah, just... Yeah, straight reskin, very, very simple to understand. So yeah.
Yeah. And our last talent, our very last, our 12th talent, tier 4 is called Fast Mutation. It's, again, tier 4. Activation is active. It's a maneuver. Non-ranked. Once per encounter, your character may spend a story point to perform a mutation power action as a maneuver. And this is a straight reskin of the Conduit talent from Realms of Tyrannoth. Definitely a tier 4. But I mean, yeah, that is what it is. And those are our talents. And Huli, how many of these were reskins compared to brand new? We had 2 or 3, I think, all new talents.
Yep. And that's all that you really need. Again, there's nothing wrong with beg, borrowing, and stealing. The things that you do have to remember, though, that if you are producing your own content for uploading onto the Foundry, you have to be really, really careful as to what you do, beg, borrow, or steal. That you have to change the wording enough, as we have in these talents, just to change it so that it's not a complete ripoff.
You can't copy paste.
No, you can't copy paste. If you need to just copy paste, you need to just reference it in either a table, as they do in Realms of Tyrannoth and Shadow of the Beanstalk, or you put it somewhere in the book that says that it uses this. The easiest way is a table to say these are the talents and where they are and what can be used.
Yeah.
But when it comes to doing the full write-up of the talent, you have to make sure that it's not a copy-paste and you do change things. And that applies to everything, including equipment and stuff like that as well.
Now, to be fair, this is not going to be a huge problem with a reskin, because if it's a reskin, you're never going to be able to get away with a copy and paste. You have different names for everything. You have different skills. You have different everything, okay? So it's for a reskin, it's typically not going to be a problem, but it's a very important point to note. And as you look at these 12 talents that we've come up with, we did our very best to follow the 3 precepts we outlined for you guys. 1, beg, borrow, and steal. 2, kiss. Keep it simple, stupid. And 3, don't go crazy. And believe me, it was hard not to go crazy. Gamers, we have the information to do so. But we decided to keep it to 12, and that's what it's going to be. But these talents are, of course, going to be fully detailed out along with the rest of the complete post-apocalyptic mutation reskin. Obviously, in the resources section, once we finish this particular series. So anxious for you guys to all get that on the table.
And just as a little bit of a snippet to get people to go and take a look at that, we are going to include a tier 5 talent as well that you can check out, and you'll only be able to find it on that document as well. So, yeah.
We don't want to give you too much. All right. Step 6?
Yep. Sounds good. So step 6 is to determine your penalties and your threats and despair results. Now that we've finished step 5, which is detailing all your talents, we can really begin to finally put the gift wrapping on all of this reskin with 2 very important things that must carry over from Magic into your reskin. The reason is that they are critical, as we've discussed way back in episode 8, to the balance of Magic and any corresponding reskin. So, Chris, let's start this process.
determine your penalties. If you guys take a listen to episode 8, and I believe episode 10 is actually where we really dug into the detail.
Right.
We covered this for existing magic rules quite extensively. And for reference, go check out page 210 of the core rulebook, specifically table 3.2-3, penalties when casting spells. Guys, magic is supposed to be hard. and the difficulties that you've assigned your spells assume that everything is perfect. They assume that you have a free hand and an unencumbered body to make your arcane gestures, that you have a clear voice to speak the magic words, and that you've got the ability to concentrate easily. And none of that is often the case in an actual encounter. As a result, adding setback dice or in some cases upgrades in some circumstances is not only expected, it is essential. It is crucial to the balance of the magic system. And as such, you have to, say it with me again, you have to represent it in your reskin. Think about how your spells are manifested. What is needed to manifest them? Are words of power, mystical gestures, strong concentration. Okay? Then think about what could hinder how those spells are manifested. Obviously, the lack of what is needed, as you just defined, for example, being gagged if you need to speak words, not having a free hand if you need mystical gestures, et cetera, et cetera. Does the lack of concentration or being distracted or stressed matter? Hint, it should. All of this should inform just a few penalties when casting the quote-unquote spells of your reskin, which Hooli leads us to our take on it for mutation powers.
We have designed a little table here, which you'll be able to read in the document, the supporting show notes. It's called Penalties When Manifesting Powers. We have listed a condition and a penalty. So we'll go through each one and discuss it if we need to. So the first one is the character requires a free hand or appendage to manifest the power easily, such as firing beams of radiation from a hand, and it's restricted in some way as per the GM's discretion. So if you don't have that, it's a single setback die.
Yeah. And this is important because with mutation abilities, it's so radical. I don't know that I mean, maybe I would, but I don't know if I would enforce this for something like psionics, okay? I don't know if I need a free hand to do it. But maybe I do. If I get cinematic that, the psychic character stretching their hand out, Jedi style to move something, that seems almost essential, right?
Yeah, right.
They don't have to do it, so maybe they suffer a setback die when they don't have it. But for something like survive, I would never really enforce this. I don't think you need a free appendage to use the survive power. Okay. Or there's several I don't think you would need a free appendage for. Enhance, definitely not. Okay. But things like strike, okay. Telekinesis, maybe, okay. And it may not necessarily be a hand. It just could be a necessary appendage. It's going to depend on the power. And the point is that's really per the GM's discretion.
And, you can also, if you're, reskinning the magic system for your setting, you really need to detail that in, I guess, the fluff side of things.
Yeah.
So, you need to look at how these things manifest. And that can be in a short story form where you give an example of somebody who's suddenly, using their mind powers, or they're using their mutations to, create bolts of energy, or any of those sorts of things. Give examples. And the best way to do that is sort of during your write-up of where the mutations came from, how they started, and that sort of thing. So really, really nut into that. And that will give you an idea as to where you would be applying these penalties and when you wouldn't.
Yeah. If you carry this over to, again, Hooli superheroes.
Yeah.
The lack of an appendage is never going to prevent Wolverine from using his healing factor. Okay.
Right. No.
Gagged and bound. But if we're going to continue with the same team of mutants, if Scott Summers, Cyclops, is without his visor, I'm going to give him a setback die because to keep from killing everyone, he has to close his eyes or put a hand over his face. Okay.
Yep.
And we've seen this in the comics, and he has to like peek out and get a blast in, but he's having trouble, right? That's a perfect example of a setback die.
I'd even go so far as an upgrade for that. Especially.
Quite agree too. But the point still applies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so the next one is the character is heavily restrained or encumbered, so the pain and bodily exertion make it hard to focus. And that's going to be another setback die. Our third one is the character is in circumstances that interfere with their ability to concentrate, such as when suffering emotional turmoil or being buffeted by environmental effects. And the penalty for that is upgrade the difficulty once or more at your GM's discretion. Now, one of the things that we start, if you look at the mutation powers, all of them start with discipline. It's only that we change that up a little bit when we introduce those talents.
And that's the idea. One of the core concepts when we go all the way back to step one, and we talked about how the power source of mutation works. Like passive abilities, that's the realms of talents. But when you're talking about powers, these are things that you have to think about. They're things you have to concentrate on. You have to will them into existence, right?
Yep.
And so, consequently, if you have something that's going to futz with that, you're going to face an upgrade. So, Huli, what other conditions do we have in this long list?
Well, that's pretty much it. For mutations, you really aren't going to have, the required usage of magic words and motions like in Magic. And yes, for those following along, you'll notice that our mutation powers base difficulties, are overall a wee bit tougher than Magic spells. Why? Because there are fewer penalties for manifesting mutant powers than for casting spells. So that's basically why.
And again, we're doing this in a sequential fashion because it's good radio. But we had an idea of what these penalties were going to be way back when we were designing our versions of the spells, the powers specifically. And the relatively few amount of penalties played into that strategy. And we kind of repeat it again. If you guys go listen to the last episode of Magic, where we did Demystifying the Mystical Part 4 back in episode 14, we kind of talk about how the overall difficulty for most of these powers a little tougher. It's a little tougher.
All right. So our next sort of ruling, I guess, is that we have to determine your threat and despair. Now, again, we spoke about this at length in episode 8, so be sure to give that a re-listen. And also reference table 3.2-4, spending threat and despair on magic skill checks on page 211 of the core rulebook. So that's specifically for magic. Obviously, use that as, based on what we're talking about now. So in episode 10, we talked about how this is another critical balance point for the magic system. Threat and despair results will be much, much worse than they are for combat checks. So be sure to give that section of episode 8 a re-listen before you do this for your reskin, because all of those are going to be the same principles that will need to apply doing it this way. So for a reskin, you should keep the penalty similar or in the same degree of negative impact. But it's really important to also give some flavor to the reskinning, to the effects if you're comparing them to the magic penalties for threats and despairs. So you really need to make the flavor and perhaps the effect itself reflective of the power source for your reskin. So what's our take on for mutation powers, Chris?
Well, we've got our own little table here, which you guys will find in our document, spending threat and despair on mutation power skill checks. So let's go through these. We've got your single threat, your double threat, your triple threat, your despair, and your double despair. And of course, all the threats can also be activated with a despair result, right? Right. So when you and as we go through this, compare this to that table on page 211. See what we're talking about with changing the flavor, both textually, but also in some cases from a mechanical standpoint. Yep. First up, we've got a single threat, or of course a despair. A couple recommended options. Metabolic exertion exhausts or damages the character, and they suffer 2 strain or 1 wound. controlling player's choice. Another option, this character and all allied characters within engaged range add a setback die to any skill checks they make until the controlling player's next turn. That is brutal. Now let's compare this, if we could, to the corresponding table for a single threat or despair from Magic. Obviously, for the first one, suffering 2 strain or a wound, that's pretty much a straight rip and replace. But obviously, we changed the flavor text to be, metabolic exertion, right?
Yep.
Now, the second one, however, we really did a brand new one for, but similar. Whereas the range was much higher and had to do with other spellcasting characters for Magic. For mutations, it really doesn't make sense. I mean, maybe you could say if I'm like a psionic character that I could disrupt the psionics of other psychic powers that other psionic characters are using. But that would be very specific. And again, we got to keep it simple, stupid, and keep it not complex. So we really want to go for that. And considering how weird mutation powers can be, it makes sense that if you screw up, you could really affect and thus give a setback die to anybody who's engaged with you.
Yeah.
Who's an ally on any check they do. Maybe they just got coated in viscous slime or experienced some psychic feedback or whatever. But to really scale it down and make it a viable penalty for a single threat, we decided to make it engaged characters, really scaling down the range compared to what you see in the Magic result for a single threat and despair.
Yeah. So our next one is 2 threats or a despair. So we've got 3 choices here. The first one is the power doesn't take effect until the start of the next round or after a minute of narrative gameplay. So that's effectively a copy paste with changing a few things to inject our setting, I guess, into this effect.
Yeah.
The second one is the character manifesting the power experiences biochemical feedback and is immobilized until the end of their next turn. Now, the second option in the core rule states if the character is using a magical item, it becomes damage 1 step. Now, since we don't really have magic items in this setting, we had to change it completely to give us a new, more thematic option. And this one certainly does that, to the point that I absolutely love biochemical feedback. It makes it immobilized. And, the immobilized condition is one of the nastiest conditions you can get because you're not running away from anything.
I wouldn't say it's the nastiest. I think staggered is probably the nastiest.
You can still run away with staggered.
That's very true. I think for 2 threat, immobilize is okay. You can't move from where you're at, but at least you can defend yourself. At least you can attack. Or at least you can use more mutation powers. Yeah.
True. And our third one is there is a minor collateral damage depending on the power type. A nearby innocent NPC suffers 2 strain or 1 wound, or a nearby piece of important equipment is damaged by 1 step. Which kind of combines a couple of things in there from the previous one. But that's cool. I like that you're not just giving setback, you're actually causing some damage to people who, you might be rescuing. And then suddenly you've got some sort of, feedback loop or something like that if we're talking telekinesis. And then suddenly the ground starts shuddering and people are falling over and, breaking ankles and stuff like that. So very, very cool. I like it.
Mm-hmm. Now, our next is for 3 threat, or of course a despair. A couple example options here. The power is stronger than expected. 1 character of the GM's choice is also targeted or otherwise affected by it. This is pretty much straight out of the Magic table. Just with its flavor text updated. And quite frankly, very worthwhile for 3 threat.
Yeah.
Then we get to the other option, which is the character enters a momentary state of metabolic rejection and is staggered until the end of their next turn. So no actions for you. until the end of your next turn, which is quite frankly pretty fitting for a 3-threat or a despair.
Yeah, absolutely. But the end of their next turn, that's insane.
Well, it's 3-threat, and that's the whole point. These need to be tough. They need to make people go, "Pull!" All right, and that's so critical to the balance. Obviously, on the magic table for 3-threat, the second option was that all other spellcasters and like attuned magical creatures within a day's travel become aware of your character, right? Which is really cool if you're talking about magic or like, psionics exclusively or something like that.
Yeah.
Or if you talk about your Star Wars reskin, the Force, okay? But doesn't make a whole lot of sense for mutation powers. So we had to come up with something new, and this seemed to fit really well.
So my favorite of all of the symbols, the despair. So we've got 1 despair and then we've got 2 despairs. So for the 1 despair, we have the character suffers metabolic shutdown and is unable to manifest mutant powers for the rest of the encounter or scene. Ouch. Very, very cool.
Then that's pretty much straight out of the magic table as well.
Exactly. And the second one is the GM picks the target of the character's power. That can go pear-shaped really quickly.
Yeah. And again, is pretty much a straight pull out of the magic table ones. It's a great one. It's a great use for despair.
I agree. The other thing to take into consideration is that, if you were playtesting this for us, and you go through, the one thing that you have to remember is this is not a finite list. And I think that that's something which is really important for people who've never, ever played this type of game before, or they've never played Star Wars or Genesis. Okay, is that this isn't an exhaustive list. However, it can be used if this is the first time you're doing it.
Yeah.
Use this as sort of a basis of ideas, a jump-off point, as it were. That you can use that just as you did when you first started playing Star Wars or first started playing Genesis. Use that for the first maybe session, maybe half session, and then just go with the rule of cool. Just something to keep in mind there. But 2 despair, Chris, talk to us about that.
The 2 despair. If you happen to roll 2 despair, heaven help you. The 2 examples we have here, the first one, and in a sense, the second one. The first one is pretty much straight out of the magic table. The second one is a riff off of it, and also similar, kind of an upgrade to what we had for 2-threat. So the first is the character endures metabolic trauma, immediately suffering 1 critical injury.
Ouch.
Boom and ouch. The second suggestion for 2 despairs, there is, if you recall, for 2-threat, we had minor collateral damage. For 2 despairs, we have major collateral damage, again, depending on the power type. A nearby piece of important equipment is completely destroyed, or an innocent NPC is physically or mentally damaged in a major way, such as being left comatose, catatonic, etc. Nasty.
Wow. Yeah, that's terrible. I'd love to see that happen at the table. I'm sort of the sadist. I don't know. But, yeah.
But totally, I mean, are you seeing, like, as we go through this, and hopefully our listeners are as well, how these results are so devastating and how they, just like magic, still represent that enhanced penalty when you roll threat and despair compared to, say, combat checks.
Absolutely. And look, another thing that you can also consider as well, and this is obviously what they've done when they've created FFG, I'm talking about, when they've created the magic threat and despair table, is that they've looked at what's in the combat table and then turn it up to 11.
Yeah.
And that's, if you don't think that something is really fitting to what you want for your, mutations or powers or whatever it is that you're going to be calling this reskin, you can always go back to that table, but then turn it up. Yeah. Look at it as a base and then go, what's worse than that?
What's twice as bad? That's the barometer.
Yeah.
Look at the negative effects for threat and despair in the combat table. When you're coming up with the threat despair table for your reskin, look at the combat table, make it twice as bad. That's the barometer. And it could even be the same bad effect, but it could be accomplished twice as easily. Okay? So if it takes 2 threat to do it, or 2 or 3 threat to do it for combat, you can do it for 1 threat with your power or spell. Okay, just twice as bad.
And that includes things like knockdown, for example.
Yeah.
Not knock down the ability, but forcing someone to fall prone. You know, they've used their mental telepathy to do a big blast of something, and all of a sudden the blast has caused this, pushback because, it's hit something harder than what it should. And suddenly you weren't ready for it and you've been flown back and you fall on your feet, et cetera, et cetera. Don't be dissing falling prone. If you've fallen prone in your turn, well, you're prone until the start of your next one. And if you've acted first in the round, you're in for a world of hurt. And everybody's getting an extra boost die if they're over the top of you. Simple as that. All right. So that's taken us all the way through that table. And, we'll, as I said, we'll have that in our document. So take a look at that and let us know. And if there's anything extra that you think should be added, let us know that as well. I'd love to see some more horrible things to do to players and NPCs.
That's taken us also through the end of step 6. So at this point, we've covered step 5. We've detailed out our talents, and we've gone through step 6. We've detailed out our penalties for manifesting these powers or casting your spells in quotation marks, and then the other part of step 6, which is to detail out, your threat and despair penalties. What is next, Hooli? Next steps.
Yeah. So at this point, we've almost completed the finish of our reskin of magic into our post-apocalyptic mutations, but we have step 7, which is define your implements and equipment. And this will bring us to our final episode in the Magic series, where we will dive deeply into the one aspect of the overall Magic system that we've yet to cover at all, and that's implements and equipment. What we'll be doing is we'll be talking about what they are, what they do, and how to design them. And then how to reskin them for your own take on Magic.
Mm-hmm. And I'm very excited for that episode. I fear it's going to be another long one.
Yeah. I love implements in the way that they've done them, but they can do so much more. So looking forward to really diving into that. So yeah, but that'll be in a few episodes' time, I'm thinking, with some of the stuff that we've got coming up, but we'll talk about that later on. But I know what we can talk about, though, Chris.
What was that?
We can talk about the wondrous people who are out there, one specific one, in fact, as we'll be talking to Mr. Seth Rattan.
Ooh, I can't wait. I've been waiting for this discussion with Seth for a while, ever since I first read the Gamemaster's Eclectic Toolbox. So, by all means, let's get into Breaking the Mould.
Breaking the Mould.
The Genesys Foundry is an exciting community of fan-created content for Genesys. New settings, new rules options, adventure and campaign modules, and the much eclectic more. But some creators go above and beyond, subverting our expectations and breaking the mold with their work. Our Breaking the Mold segment is dedicated to showcasing an exciting offering available right now in the Genesys Foundry as we separate the pure alloy from the slag and point you to the best content out there.
Now, tonight's guest is the mind behind the StorySpanner.net, a community and fan blog all about Genesys, which focuses on useful content and advice for game masters and designers. Advice, game aids, ready-to-play modules, design patterns, and small module rule kits for both Genesys and Star Wars. But a while back, he released the Gamemaster's Eclectic Toolbox on the Foundry, which was a 29-page compilation of highly effective house rules, tricks and tips for Genesys to make your games even better than they already are. Things like methods to quickly create adversaries, guidelines for awarding XP, how to use maps and miniatures in your games, adversary morale, random character creation, and so much more.
It was a really impressive product. I love adversary morale. I know we're going to hopefully talk about that in more detail. But, since this came out, we were really eager to get Mr. Rattan on the Forge to talk about it. And finally, we got our schedules to mesh up. And with that, we are proud to welcome for his first time on the Forge podcast, Mr. Seth Rattan. Seth, welcome to the show, man.
Great to be here.
Absolutely glad to have you. Let's start with a bit of introduction. For some of our listeners, they're probably hearing you, meeting you, virtually, auditorily, for the very first time. So please tell us a little bit about yourself and your gaming career.
Well, I started gaming after college, which is a lot later than many, many people. That was around 7 years ago. And I was playing at the time in a friend's Star Wars game using a homebrewed system. This was in the days when there were only D20 and Saga Edition. And around about 2015, while I was working at a local game store, right before Force and Destiny released, I discovered Fantasy Flight's Star Wars RPG. And just fell in love with the dice, fell in love with what they do for gameplay, what they do for getting players to be more actively engaged rather than just being a stat block of death. Since then, I've played and tried a lot of things, but I still mostly stick to Star Wars RPG and Genesys. And when I'm not doing that, I'll do some old school D&D or some of the also old school the West End Games D6 system. 2 years ago, I started the Story Spanner blog because I had a bunch of stuff I wanted to share after Genesys released, and I need to update that blog more frequently than I do. And from there, that's about where we are.
And it's an absolutely amazing website, can I just say. So go and take a look at that, listeners, if you haven't already. It's full of great ideas. It's an amazing, amazing site, Seth. I've used it quite a number of times. So yeah, well done there. So, we ask all of our guests this question. So what sort of style of game or game setting or theme do you like to get on the table when you play? What's your favorite thing to play in Genesys?
Well, like so many listeners to the podcast, I came to Genesys from the Star Wars RPG. Mm-hmm. But I also, like I said, I started gaming late, and some of the first RPGs I played were on the computer. Knights of the Old Republic, Morrowind, Mass Effect, that kind of thing. And in all of those games, they're all great games, but in all of those games, you will eventually run into these walls. And sometimes it's very elegant, like Morrowind, where there's just an ocean around everything, and that's the end of what's been prepared. Sometimes it's not so elegant. In Knights of the Old Republic on Tatooine or in The Witcher 3, there will literally just be text that comes up on the screen and says, "There's nothing more, turn back." And my first revelation, my first aha moment when I started playing RPGs wasn't really about the kind of genre or story. It was about setting and world. My aha moment was that moment when you realize, oh, there are no walls. Oh, I can go anywhere because the person preparing the content is right in front of me. And if they're good at what they're doing, you can just keep running on the biggest left turn you want to. So I put all kinds of genres on the table, but for me, role-playing games are really about trying to experience and explore a world through a character's eyes.
Very well said. Lots of good things we shall get framed on our walls. Ironically, there are no walls. Get that framed on your wall. Say there are no walls. At that point, it's also ironic, but also very good advice. Very good advice. So speaking of very good advice, Seth, let's talk about the Gamemaster's Eclectic Toolkit. Give us the pitch, man. Tell us about the supplement. How would you describe it to someone who might be interested in purchasing it?
So, the Gamemaster's Eclectic Toolkit is a collection of house rules that I've used in the various RPG campaigns I've run over the years. It covers things like adversary creation, adversary morale, skill challenges in a fair amount of detail, awarding XP, designing new talents, and a lot more. Most of these rules are filling in little bits of wisdom that I found to be missing when I was running a Star Wars RPG, especially early on, and especially where similar bits of wisdom that you might try to import from other systems like D&D don't really translate that well. So it's trying to fill in that wisdom place. There's also a big focus on speed running the game and time management at the table. So how do you make things go fast so there's less dead time? I just feel like dead time at the table is as bad as dead air on a podcast, and you don't get to edit it out at the table. The book is also thoroughly digitally crossed, linked, and bookmarked, so it's designed for reference, and it's designed for you to take the pieces that you want and leave the pieces that you don't.
Because that's something that doesn't get done very often, is that whole linking. You want it to be able to find things quickly, and that's obviously what the Eclectic Toolkit is all about. So you want to make it easier for the GM who's running encounters and just running the campaign generally to be able to find stuff in a flash. So yeah, that's great advice there.
And it's not too difficult to do in InDesign. I haven't used that new program people have been talking about, whose name I can't even remember. But I know in InDesign it's a very it takes time, but it's not a challenging thing to add on. So it's surprising to me that so many professional companies don't do it with the PDFs they publish.
So what was the impetus in the first place to make such a diverse supplement, filled with so many different things? Was it hard to narrow down what you wanted to put in? I mean, obviously with someone with your experience, and the knowledge base and wisdom, as Chris mentioned before, that you've got all of effectively your brain filled with the stuff that game masters should be doing to make their games great. So how did you go through the narrowing down process for that?
So the original impetus, years and years before the Foundry or even Genesys, was to have all my house rules written down in one place where I could reference them, just in a Word document. After I started the blog, the storyspanner.net, I looked at the document and started polishing it up to see if it was something I could put up there. But it really only kicked into high gear when the Genesys Foundry was announced, and I asked myself, hey, I wonder if I could sell this instead. I wonder if it's worth that much to people. That though, it turned out to be right. It was worth a lot, but it took a lot more polish than I'd expected to get it to something that I was comfortable selling.
Yeah.
There's sort of also the opposite of an impetus maybe, but there was a bit of an animus in creating it in that, and I'll read from the introduction here. A person who comes to our community excited about Genesys with a question about how to do something unusual and departs with the curt reply, just don't bother with that, is a person we turned away needlessly. I'd rather tell that person, here's something that won't break the game, go knock yourself out. And that, I see it on the forums and the subreddit, the Discord, and your guys' forums and Facebook pages are better about it, but people will post an idea they have, and a lot of people will just say, yeah, don't do that. Don't do that in this system. That doesn't mix well. And, that answer, it doesn't do it for me. I think back in particular to the maps and minis rules, I remember someone had posted this 20 or 30-page document of rules for miniatures with Star Wars RPG. And I looked at the document, and I thought, well, this is not how I would do it. And I looked at the replies, and it was just people telling him, basically give up. And to me, that's the wrong answer. That really was the sort of impetus and animus for it.
I'm slow clapping over here. That's truly wonderful. And I'm ashamed to say, more often than I would like, I'm often guilty of that same thing. And it takes a lot of creativity and heart for us as designers and game masters to come to that need with an open mind, but at the same time, a level of system understanding and mechanical reality to make something balanced. If somebody came to me with a 20 or 30 page document to use minis in the system, I'd be like, wow, that's probably not how I would do it. I think you may have seriously overthought it. There may be a much simpler way to do it. But the last thing I would say is, for example, because it's a great example. I remember which one you're talking about. The last thing to do is say, yeah, just don't use minis. I mean, if somebody comes to you with something they want to insert into the game, there's an itch that they're wanting in their experience to be scratched. And honestly, you're right. The worst thing you can do is say, oh, it's not really an itch. Just ignore it. Instead, the good GM or the good designer comes up with a way. Okay, well, let's find a way to scratch that itch, but do it in a very balanced way that really is representative of the rules and flows perfectly. And Seth, that's something I've seen with. I'll gush a bit. I was very impressed with this work. And yes, it was beautiful. It was well laid out. I love the cross-linking you had all over the place. But I'm sorry, you had some fantastic content in here. Stuff that I was like, wow, that's elegantly done. That is in the spirit of the system. So it's clear to me, at least, that you took that to heart when you came up with this. It's great, man. It's great.
Absolutely. And it's, especially now with all the things that have been going on with Asmodee, if we in the community tell someone, hey, don't bother with that, they're not going to keep trying to bother with that. They're going to go pick another system. And that's the last thing we want.
Exactly. Absolutely. So, okay, in this supplement of 29 pages, you've got, a few dozen major areas of house rule suggestions, tips, and tricks. What was the process like for compiling these all? Are they all things that you have personally used? I mean, ultimately, I guess my question is, for all this, what did the playtesting process look like as well?
So this is an interesting question. I've used almost everything in the toolkit over the years, and it is sort of the stuff that has survived at my table, and that's the best test, I think, for any house rule is, are you willing to use it again, or do you need to change it? But there are a couple things I haven't, and there are a couple things where the playtesting looks a little different. So one or two things like the detective career I haven't put on the table yet, but I didn't feel too bad about that because it is mostly serving as an example of how you could design a career rather than literally this is ready to go right now. Some other things like quick adversary initiative. This is an example of where playtesting doesn't have to involve other people if you can't find other people. For that, I literally just took my big binder of Star Wars and Genesys adversary cards and some old character sheets and rolled up about 30 different initiatives until the rules were producing something that worked. So don't feel like, listener, if you can't find people to play with right now, there's nothing you can playtest about your work. I guarantee there is.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's one of the things that obviously when people aren't necessarily with groups and they are creative people, you know, for whether it be for work reasons, whether it be just geography, that having the means to playtest is a, you know, can be a barrier for people to release product. And it may be absolutely amazing product that if they're not doing that playtesting, they're going to feel, no, sorry, I just can't do that. You know, there's always the internet, then you can throw ideas out there with people that you trust. But yeah, if at a pinch, definitely something like what you're talking about is absolutely perfect.
Yep. Another important part of playtesting, I think, is feedback. And I just mentioned that because there's a great example of it in here. Under the random characters section, the two people I went to most often for feedback were my very good friends, Sam and Shane, who ran some of the first games I played in. And when they both looked at the random characters page, I was kind of wondering, you know, I have this table of dice rolls and I have this picture of dice rolls, and which one is more clear? And Shane came back to me and he said, I didn't quite get it until I saw the picture below. And then Sam piped up and kind of said, well, I thought the table was much more clear. And I immediately knew, okay, I've got to keep both of these things. And that's the sort of thing you don't find out if you're not willing to show your work to other people. So that's just as important part of playtesting and developing the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Seth, we've talked a lot about the product, but can you give us perhaps a glimpse of something exciting or unique in the Gamemaster's Eclectic Toolbox to whet our appetite a little bit, or perhaps share with us your favorite part of the advice that you've given in the supplement?
Well, my favorite part, or at least the part I use probably the most often, is the idea of clout rating. Early on, I started by creating adversaries as if they were player characters, and that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. Don't do that. I know we just said, don't tell people not to do something, but don't do that.
Don't do that. No.
But the second stage I used was a little bit of a modification from the episode of a certain Order 66 podcast about creating adversaries. And you can see that in the free sample. That's sort of my evolution of that system, where I add in little arrays for characteristics and skill ranks to make that go faster. But then I eventually one day just said, what if I just pick one number and see what happens? And it turns out that if you pick one number as the adversary's default characteristic rating, that number is also going to be their most common dice pool size. It's also going to be the most common difficulty that other players make checks against that adversary. And it's the number you'll refer to most often. So it let me kind of create adversaries on the fly and very naturally fill in details if those adversaries turned out to be more important.
That's very cool. And I'm glad to hear you bring in Order 66. I know which episode you're talking about. That was a fun episode. And there's a lot we've all learned, I think, that's coming up into this. So, I mean, and you've got some amazing advice. I want to call a bit of an audible here. Can you talk to us a little bit about morale? Because I'm sorry, there's a lot of really useful stuff in here, Seth, and so many useful things for so many GMs. Possibly my favorite thing in here is morale. Yeah. But that's Julio, I think you might share the same opinion.
Yep.
But I find it to be elegantly done and a wonderful addition that really doesn't have a corollary in the game right now. Can you give us a little bit of a peek behind the curtain on morale and what it is for listeners?
So morale is the idea of answering the question, when should an adversary retreat from a combat, right? For player characters, the players are going to know when it's time for them to retreat. They're attached to their characters. They're going to be making that decision for themselves. But I, as a game master, and I think most game masters, aren't particularly attached to most of the adversaries I might throw at the party. And I think this idea of morale is one I pulled from old school D&D, which I also play quite a bit of, where monsters have rules for morale, for when they retreat. And there's an expectation also, just like in Genesys, I think, that sometimes the party will retreat. And D&D really 3rd, 4th, 5th edition kind of shifted to this world of, the monster is an Energizer bunny and it's just going to keep bouncing into the party until either the party is dead or it is. And somehow we got to a place, especially with a lot of DMs coming in from 5th edition, where that's the default thinking. And without a framework for a different thinking, it's hard to move away from that. So that was sort of why I put it in there. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make it work elegantly. And eventually the answer I came to is that the same factors for when you should make a morale check should also decide how hard it is. So there are only that many things to remember.
Mm-hmm. And it's very well done. I mean, for me, that one page is worth the price of admission alone. Mm-hmm. Because this is something that because we GMs who have been role playing for a long time, those of us who unlike you, it seems, and this is probably to your benefit, those of us who cut our teeth on D20, on 3rd edition D&D primarily. You hit the nail on the head. Threats are Energizer bunnies. Okay, when do they run away? When the story demands it. But typically they don't. But it's and the GM will typically just forget about, he's dead. But it seems like every bad guy just fights till they're dead. And the core mechanics of this system, the underlying mechanical weave and balance, don't necessarily assume that a bad guy is going to fight until he's done. And so having this, but then the question is, okay, when do they leave? And making it dice rolls, making it a part of their own capabilities, and having appropriate difficulties based on what you've got in here, it adds a level of gravitas to that decision. But more importantly, the all too important element of chance. The same thing the PCs have to deal with when they face a fear check, okay, or when they make a combat check. Things just could go their way, or they could go horribly wrong. And the same can happen for threats. And sometimes, my gosh, you just roll poorly when it comes to something like morale, and that guy's going to split. And it's sort of, I don't know, like in my opinion at least, an underutilized and underexplored avenue of the PC-NPC relationship, without getting into game theory, design geekery too terribly. But just well done, man. Well done.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to add to that as well. One of the examples that I use when I start talking morale is if you've got something like just a grizzly bear, even if it's a dire bear or whatever else that goes into hunt for food, and as a result it sees the party as food, and so it goes into attack. A lot of GMs and DMs alike they let that creature just keep on attacking until it's dead. And then, the PCs grab whatever treasures left behind and move on. But if we're talking real life, a creature is only going to stick around for as long enough that they have the upper hand. So having a system in there, because, it doesn't exist in Genesys. So I'd like to reiterate exactly what Chris said, that well done on this system, because it really focuses in on that whole, okay, so if there's, the circumstances that are going to exist through dice rolling, that's what you're going to be using to go run the hell away. So I think that it's absolutely brilliant. So well done.
Dude. Okay, Seth, last thing to talk about, and maybe the most important question for you tonight. What is next for you, thestoryspanner.net, and the Foundry?
Well, like I said, I need to update the blog more often than I do. I have a lot of projects in various stages of the works, but for me, the next thing is a product I'm calling City Pulse, a cyberpunk urban sandbox kit. It'll be Android compatible. It draws a lot of inspiration from the Galactic campaign guide of the D20 Star Wars role-playing game. It does a couple of cool things. It'll make use of the 10-fold tables I have at the end of the Toolbox for common city locations like bars, nightclubs, shops, corporate offices, back alleys. And it also evolves the idea of clout rating into something I'm calling polymorphic adversaries. So by pairing a clout rating with a random table of descriptor tags, each stat block will be reusable again and again in different ways. It's if I'm being conservative, it's at least 2 months away from being finished, however. And in general, I feel more like a tinkerer than an author. So each product I publish on Foundry will probably be not centered around, but it'll be supported by at least one interesting mechanical idea I've been toying with for a while.
Ooh, God, caught me out that hook, man. That sounds exciting. 2 months can't come fast enough. It's fantastic. Well,
I've set a deadline for myself publicly now. I don't know how I feel about that, but we'll see how it goes.
Set it now. You can't take it back. That's how it works.
Oh, no. What have I done?
You may not be aware of this, but what you say on this podcast is actually etched into stone tablets in my garage, and I take those to a secret underground layer where they are all stored. No one ever sees them, of course, but they're there, so it is in stone. I'm just saying. We're going to hold you to that. Well, listen, Gamer Nation, as you're listening, if you have not had the chance to pick up the Gamemaster's Eclectic Toolkit, you really need to do so. When this product first dropped on the Foundry and I read it, I was blown away. I am, and Seth, I say this in all earnestness, I am proud as a community member to have this product on our Foundry. Okay. And you should be proud of it as well. It is well written, it is well designed, and it has a wealth of knowledge that I think any GM could benefit from. So if you guys are listening, you really need to check it out.
Could not agree more. It's fantastic.
Thank you guys so much.
Of course, man. Thank you for making it.
Yes, Seth, on behalf of Chris and myself, and of course our listeners, thank you so much for coming on to the show tonight. We really do appreciate your time and everything that you've put together in the supplement, and obviously whatever else is coming in the pipeline. So thanks again.
Thank you. Great to be on the show, and I hope eventually when City Pulse gets finished, we will be talking again.
Look forward to it, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was very exciting.
So great, man. I love that supplement. It was so great to finally be able to get Seth on the show and get our schedules to mesh up. So he's done good work. Seriously, guys, you got to go check that out.
He's got some serious GMing creds behind him, just very quietly. And a bit of a man crush maybe from my end.
Nothing wrong with that at all. Nothing wrong with that.
Indeed.
There may be even something a little right with it, Huli. But speaking of something right with it,
that's a terrible segue, Chris.
I'm the master of terrible segues. Let's see if we can do right by some of our listeners with a couple of interesting listener questions. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds good, and we'll be talking about those under the hammer.
Under the Hammer.
And welcome to Under the Hammer, the segment where we answer your games and rules questions about the Genesys role-playing game as it impacts both rules, content creation, and play. Again, we've got some great questions this week. So, Chris, would you like to start us off?
Absolutely. This actually comes in via Reddit. Holla from Cody Saboa, who asked the following. I'm pretty new to tabletop role-playing, but my kids want to play. God love you, Cody. I've started on the Star Wars role-playing game, but I'm considering Genesys as well. I'm learning how to GM, and I'm unsure what's the best way to weave the characters' personal stories into the adventure I have planned.
Good question. A little bit open-ended, but it's almost an episode within itself when talking about that sort of character, integration into a story. I had an answer for him, specifically when talking about Star Wars. You've got some great tools, and I'll talk about Shadow of the Beanstalk in a moment. But with Star Wars specifically, more particularly with Edge of the Empire, with its obligation, it is a great way to link in players into the immediate story. And for those who aren't familiar with it, you have an obligation score. which can go up and down during the length of the campaign. And normally you start with 1, maybe 2 obligations. And if you take an obligation, you get so many extra points to spend on your character in the form of XP. So what happens is that, and Chris, you've done an entire episode on obligation and morality and duty. But with obligation, you obviously set everybody's table up, and then you work out the percentages, and then you roll that on a table they suggest at the start of a session. I like what GM Phil suggested, which was you do it at the end of the last session. So, you don't do one for the first session. For the second one, you roll that at the end of the first session so that you've got some planning time to do. And then also the players have got, what does that mean? How come the bounty hunter's been rolled? We're not in that sort of scenario. What's that going to do? And it creates that fantastic sort of element, which is outside of game time, where you've got players talking about the campaign. And so you're really creating more of an investment to the overall campaign as well. So that's one way of doing it. For Age of Rebellion, there is the duty mechanic, which is a same sort of process, but a different way of doing it that focuses on what the speciality or what the motivation is for the character to be involved in the rebellion in the first place. And then you have morality, which I don't necessarily do it the same way that obligation is done, but it can work in a similar sort of way, where each of the characters have a morality score that goes up and down depending on what sort of actions that they're taking during the campaign, because that's just how the Force works. As I said, I'll talk briefly about Shadow of the Beanstalk. Shadow of the Beanstalk does have the system which is about favors. And that works very similar, but in my opinion, better than the way that it works with obligation. And these are things that the players have a little bit more control over. They decide to align themselves with a certain faction to do something for that faction, whether it be that, they've done a small favor, a medium favor, or a large favor. And that can come back to plague the characters quite often during the campaign. And they can actually be bought off over time, and then they can also gain new favors as well. And if they're desperate, they may decide that they want to try to get a large favor off someone. And it just builds in, and there's no dice rolling and whatever else you use. You've just got that listed of what they're doing. And what organizations they have debts to. And of course, as GM Huz did to us, we had conflicting favors all over the place, including in some, like one character had 2 conflicting things on the same favor tree. But anyway, that was that was a nightmare to say the least. But that's a really good way that you can bring in the backstories of how they got those talents or how they got those favors in the first place to bring into the story that you can introduce into the ongoing campaign. Chris, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this.
Yeah, let's keep, he asked about Genesys. Let's talk about desire, fear, strength, and flaw. It is sadly because I think when you compare to Star Wars, where especially with obligation and duty and to a degree morality, you have a mechanical consequence.
Yep.
Usually positive or sometimes negative, that comes with these. Characters really enjoy them, and players enjoy spending a lot of time on them.
Yep.
I'm sad to see that character motivation, the 6th step of character creation in Genesys, which doesn't share the same mechanical benefit, is often glossed over, unfortunately, by a lot of players, and that's really unfortunate. I would encourage you with Genesys to really start there. Especially if you're teaching your son or your daughter. You say kids. I don't know how many children you have. When you go through character creation and you have that session 0, really, as a GM and a teacher, walk through the motivations, make them spend serious time on it, really defining what their character's desires are, what their strengths are, and their fear and their flaw. And compared to Star Wars, where to some degree, morality was a bit generic, but to some degree, you had very specific things that you owed or needed to accomplish. Motivation in Genesys is upscaled a bit, kind of like the rest of the system. It's much more simpler.
Yep.
And I find that tends to make things a little easier to actually weave into the story. If I have an obligation that I owe a local lord some money, and therefore I've got to do what he tells me to do, that stinks, and I'll have to deal with it. But I can buy that off, or I can get past it, or reach a point where I don't care. When you really dive into, okay, what your character, your character's afraid of being wrong, okay? You can weave that into a story every session if you need to. It gives you the license to enact those various character motivation aspects simply with the way that you play NPCs and how they react. And as a GM, especially with kids, take that moment when you're doing it. It's like, if they say, well, I laugh at him, okay, would you care to do that? Because this guy just told you were wrong. Okay. You make that subtle nudge, and it reminds the player, especially younger player, oh, wait, I have this flaw for my character. Okay. I have this fear. And it can really prompt an exciting role-playing decision that, at least in my experience, gets the players to a much deeper level of engagement when it comes to their it's not so much weaving their backstory, it's weaving their personal story and personality into the adventure and into the game. And those are the moments that they're really going to remember.
Yep. Because they start thinking about things as their character would. And that means that, some of the decisions that they make, they may sort of stumble as a normal person would with any sort of major life decision. That is certainly, as you say, Chris, it's going to give that real immersive quality to your game. So, yeah, very good point. Very, very good point. Excellent. All right. So hopefully that answers your question, Cody. And thanks for listening. And hopefully we'll hear from you soon. Our next question is from Dylan Sargent, who asks on the FFG forums. He says, one of my players recently wanted to pour a pool of gas on the ground and wait with his Zippo at the ready. He said that if the monster got close, he wanted to drop the Zippo and run before it had a chance to attack. Other systems that I'm familiar with give players a chance to prep an action and then interrupt in an enemy's turn. How could Genesys handle the same thing? Chris.
Man. So to continue the wisdom of Seth that was just dropped on us, the easy answer here would be to say, yeah, Genesys doesn't do that. There are no readied actions in the system.
Right.
Okay. That's a really crappy answer, isn't it? So allow me to share with you, Dylan, what I did in a similar situation for a player, and the party really enjoyed it. It wasn't Zippo and gasoline, but it was a readied action that had to do with a grenade. Right. And I'll leave it at that. And the player kind of said the exact same thing. He says, I'm brandishing this grenade, and I want to ready an action to just throw it at the ground if he comes close enough to me and then get away. And if you look at a system like Dungeons and Dragons, it becomes this mechanical chess game. Well, okay, I've readied the action. Oh, he triggered my readied action. Now what I do happens. And I did it. And I run away. Okay.
Right.
And you can do that in D&D. And I'm sorry, that's just not very dynamic. There's not a whole lot of risk involved with that, is there, Hooli?
No, there isn't.
Do you know how risk is represented in this system? Skill checks.
Right.
So in this scenario, I would do what I had my player did. I said, oh man, that sounds like an awesome idea. I really like it. I would like you to please make a vigilance check opposed by this character's vigilance. We're going to see if your readied action pulls off.
Right.
Are you faster than him, or is he faster than you? All right. And dude, we did it at the table, and the whole table was like everyone just shut up. It was instant engagement at the table. All right.
Right.
And basically that was his action to do that. And what it meant was if he pulled it off, I basically gave him a free maneuver out of turn. That's really what it came down to. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So he had the chance to run away if he was successful. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even have him make the check until the guy got close on his turn. Right.
Right.
Another way to do it is to have a player set up and spend an action to set this scenario, similar scenario up. And you can, although I will typically advocate that you always have the PCs roll whenever possible, you can reverse it as well. Okay. Where the NPC, as they're coming up on their turn, are forced to reactively, as an incidental, make that opposed check against you. Okay. Mm-hmm. In whatever versus skills matter. In this scenario, vigilance versus vigilance made a whole lot of sense.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you can use that same methodology in all kinds of things. Just what do the dice tell you? And it was great. And in his role, he actually succeeded, but he ended up with I think it was 3 threat. Mm-hmm. And so he managed to run. He managed to drop the grenade, but he couldn't get away in time. And so the grenade blast went off and actually knocked him prone. And it was really cool narrative, and it adds so much more than the simple chess game of readied actions that's Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, true.
I don't know. That's my suggestion. That's how I've handled similar things, and what I would suggest in this case.
One of the things that I'd like to suggest as well, it's a little bit sort of, I've never actually tried it, but when I received this question, I really sort of started to think about this. But one thing that you could do is you could say, okay, with the rules as they are, if you roll 2 advantage, you can gain a maneuver, okay, for free. Basically, it doesn't cost you that extra 2 strain if you've rolled with your action to get that second maneuver. So if you have a scenario with this and you've got a player that says that they want to do this, obviously, when it comes to any sort of combat, it's not really 100% simulationist anyway, because everything happens all at once. So if you've got a scenario where you've got a big brown bear, I'll go back to my brown bear theory. If you go back to the brown bear and it's racing towards you, and you've got this whole scenario where you've got the Zippo ready to go, I would perhaps, to make things really simple without adding an additional check, is to say, right, well, it would normally cost 2 advantage to do an additional maneuver. If you roll 3 advantage for this check, you can basically do exactly what it is that you want to do to move away before that happens. So that they're using that action to sort of prep, which is what D&D does anyway. And if those sort of circumstances don't pan out anyway, because the monster is smart enough and stops, and so consequently that prep action doesn't happen. So we've already got advantage in our system that we can utilize. Use it for something to allow players to do what they want to do. That's just my suggestion. You might want to make it 2 and might want to make it 3. It depends on the scenario, I guess. But that would be I think yours is obviously got a lot more, player involvement with it, certainly. And it makes it more exciting at the table when you're making those sorts of checks. But
readied actions always bug the heck out of me because they're boring.
I agree. But they're also fraught with danger too.
Well, they are, but I mean, it comes down to the player feels a sense of I mean, it's like oh, I've made a good chess move is really what it comes down to.
Sure.
And I'm sorry, that's boring. It's not cinematic.
Yep.
Inject some cinema to it, and both our suggestions all rely on one thing, and that is the beautiful mechanic of the narrative dice.
Right. Exactly. So, yeah, just some suggestions for you there, Dylan. Take on board what we've said and, let us know how you handle things once you've got past this scenario. So, Chris, what's our last question?
It comes in via Facebook from Alex Pepper, who says the following. When designing an archetype/species, how many pros versus cons should be considered? I.e., if an archetype race is given 2 starting talents, what negatives should be applied to balance? I have an easy answer.
Go.
There is no answer to that question. You can apply no negatives. That's the thing. It just means that they have a smaller starting XP pool.
Right.
There is no balance. You don't even need negatives. You don't even need positives. You can take a look at the EPG for I think it's the Survivalist, I forget what it's called. It's one of the new archetypes that basically it's got more negatives than it does positives, but it has boss starting XP. Okay, it's the sum game is not positives versus negatives. It's that positives detract from your starting XP, and that negatives add to your starting XP. Yep. That's the sum game. Yeah. So there is no you can give a starting race 2 talents with no negatives. It just means that their starting XP is going to be low.
And when we say talents, we obviously mean special abilities.
Yes. But,
so that's something to point out, Alex. Yeah.
Yes, but to use the terminology of his question, yes.
Yeah.
So I mean that's the simple answer. I mean, you can go tit for tat, but as the EPG shows us, you don't have to like. And I'll be blunt. I made, I think, the mistake of trying to develop that balance early on myself, because when we were homebrewing Star Wars species, that's also what we tried to do.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh well, no, you need the negative to balance the positive. But as the EPG kind of opened my eyes, where it's like, wait, I don't need that at all. This dude has a bunch of cons, a bunch of negatives. His positive is the fact that he's got 120 starting XP. Okay,
right.
That's the positive. Or this dude has a whole bunch of pros. He's got 3 special abilities and like no negatives, but he's only got 65 starting XP. That's the con. Okay.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you look at the science fiction setting, which or space opera setting, I think it is in the core rules, where it talks about the psionic. You know, it has only a starting XP of 70, but the powers that it has, it's nuts. So it goes down to whatever theme that you're looking for. Now, obviously, a psionic in this sort of circumstance in the core rules, they're obviously very, very focused at what they do. Hence the reason they don't tend to deviate outside of using their mental abilities. And that shows because they don't have time for anything else. Hence the reason why they have 70 XP. But as you say, Chris, you've got some of the other ones that have got like 120, 110, but their abilities aren't all that fantastic. And that can represent a number of things. That can represent that the species is pretty much a jack of all trades. If you're doing sort of like a sci-fi sort of setting, where they don't have one particular specialization. Sure, they might be great pilots and they're renowned throughout the galaxy, but for the most part, they move through all ways of life. So, you know, I agree with you. I don't think that there's an exact sort of formula. And I think maybe that Alex is looking for like a rule of thumb of how many special abilities and negative special abilities should be added to a species when you're designing it. It goes down to feel, honestly. You know, you look at some of the stuff that we've done in when we've been looking at archetypes, which concentrate on certain stats, for example. You know, we've gone as far as the Minotaur that I did, and there was a lot of special abilities, but the XP that I got at the end was quite low, and that's where you start going, okay, do I need to have this? Do I need to have that? And during that sort of formulation process of designing it, you need to start looking at, is somebody going to want to play this character? And this is the other downside. If you've got someone like the Psionic who has that 70 XP, but has all these special abilities, there's only a certain type of player with a certain type of taste that is probably going to play that type of character. Where if you've got someone who has 110 to 100 XP, they're more likely to go, right, well, I have a little bit more freedom in what I want to do. Because players want that freedom to be able to create the sort of things that is in their mind, the perfect character. But it may not necessarily be what's in your mind. So, you've just got to play that balance game.
Yeah. And if you are looking for a rule of thumb, Alex, start with XP.
Yes.
Get in your head, okay, I want this species, this archetype to have 90 XP. I want them to have 100 XP. Then add your positives that you want them to have, your pros. Then you just do the math and you'll determine how many cons you need to add. Yeah. And it's not necessarily one or two. Or three. It could be three tiny ones. It could be one huge one. Okay. So, again, a rule of thumb is if you're looking for a better way to balance it out, start with the XP as the goal. That's another tactic I've often used when creating archetypes right here on this show, as Willie said.
Yep. Well, hopefully, Alex, that answers your question. And I have to point out a big shout out to Alex, as he is, well, firstly, he's one of my fellow Australians. And secondly, is a person responsible for doing the maps in the one's out and one's forthcoming of the Terranoth Adventures by Darren West. Alex does some amazing work, and if you're interested in getting Alex to do some work for you for a product for the Foundry, just please drop me a line and I can put you in touch with him. So yay Australians. And
you Aussies. Maps in your barbies.
Dear, I love it when you try it.
I can keep going. And speaking of Uli, it's sad, so sad, but we are now at the end of yet another show.
You know that I can't listen to that without laughing my head off. Anyway, yes, it is the end of the show, but we will be back in either just a couple of weeks or a month. We're not quite sure yet. But when we do come back, you will be amazed and excited, as we have a very, very special show planned where we'll be welcoming back to the show Sam Gregor-Stewart to talk about specialization trees.
I cannot wait for that.
It's going to be epic. So much to look forward to with that, and I've already got my ideas going. So we'll talk more about that online, and we'll go from there. But while you wait for the release of that episode, please continue to send us any other questions that you might have about Genesys, about being a GM or a player, or just any gaming related questions you like. And how can they do that, Chris?
Well, they can email us at forgegenesis@d20radio.com or post it up via one of our many social media platforms, including Facebook, the Twitter, YouTube, and Reddit, by searching at Forge Genesis. We've also been having some really good conversations on the D20 Radio Discord channel, and of course, truly dedicated conversations with our patrons on our very own Patreon podcast Discord server.
And we would love to hear from you all. So don't forget that you can also join the even larger discussion in the D20 Radio Facebook group, where we nerds congregate to cross-pollinate.
And don't forget to give us a like or a follow on any of our social media sites. You can also drop us a review on those sites or your favorite podcatcher, including iTunes and Spotify. You can also, of course, visit our website at forgegenesis.com.
Yes, those reviews, we would love to see more of them. It does help us bump up the queue on iTunes. And it also lets us know how we're doing. We like to hear that as well. And if you've got some ideas, a new segment for the show or something, anything, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Well, Chris, that's a wrap for us. Thank you to all of our listeners for listening. And we hope you will join us next time as we continue to explore the Genesys Role Playing Game. I'm GM Hurley. May your triumphs be many and your despairs be few.
And I'm GM Chris, wishing you peace, love, and good gaming.
Thanks again for joining us, listeners, and remember, The Forge Podcast, helping you hone your gaming edge. The Forge, a Genesys podcast, is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Forge is a fan-generated podcast. All the information provided on the podcast, the social media, and related website is not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensors. The content of this podcast remains the property of The Forge, a Genesys RPG podcast, and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The Genesys Role Playing Game, Genesys logo, Genesys Foundry, content, and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games. All products available on the Genesys Foundry website remain the property of their respective companies and individuals. For more information about The Forge, the Genesys RPG podcast, visit www.forgegenesis.com.